Close your eyes and imagine a single leaf. Just one fragile green leaf growing on a mountainside in South America, 5,000 years ago. This leaf holds a secret that would topple empires, corrupt governments, make billionaires out of peasants and corpses out of kings. This is the story of cocaine, a tale so twisted and dark that it reads like fiction, except every word you're about to hear actually happened. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, let me take you on a journey through time, through jungles and palaces, through laboratories and back alleys, through the rise and fall of some of the most powerful criminals the world has ever known. This isn't just history. This is the biography of a molecule that changed everything. Before we begin this journey together, I want you to know that what you're about to experience is thoroughly researched, deeply engaging, and designed to carry you gently into sleep while feeding your mind fascinating truths. If you appreciate stories like this, stories that educate while they relax, go ahead and subscribe to Dreamless Timelines. We're building something special here, a community of curious minds who love to learn as they rest. Now let that pillow cradle your head a little deeper, and let's go back to the beginning. Long before the Spanish arrived, before Europeans even knew the Americas existed, there was a civilization in the Andes Mountains that understood something the modern world would take millennia to rediscover. The Inca people, masters of engineering and agriculture, cultivated a plant they called the divine leaf, Erythroxylum coca. The coca plant grew naturally on the steep mountainsides of what we now call Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia, thriving in altitudes where oxygen grew thin and life became difficult. The Incas didn't see coca as a drug. They saw it as a gift from Inti, the sun god himself. According to their legends, Inti gave coca to humanity as a way to ease suffering, to help people endure the harsh conditions of mountain life. And it worked. When you chew coca leaves, a mild stimulant effect occurs. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just a gentle lifting of fatigue, a suppression of hunger, a slight numbing of altitude sickness. For people living at 12,000 feet above sea level, building cities in the clouds, coca was practical medicine. But here's where it gets interesting. The Incas didn't let just anyone chew coca. This wasn't some free-for-all plant. No, the ruling class, the nobility, the priests, they controlled access to coca the way modern governments control access to gold reserves. Common people could only chew coca leaves during special ceremonies or when they were performing particularly brutal labor for the empire. It was a tool of control as much as it was a gift from the gods. Imagine you're a farmer in the 1400s, living in the shadow of Machu Picchu. Your life is hard. You wake before dawn, work until your muscles scream, eat corn and potatoes if you're lucky, and fall asleep on a mat made of woven grass. But once in a while during harvest time or when you're conscripted to build another temple, the priests allow you to chew coca. Suddenly, the fatigue melts away. Your hunger disappears. You can work for hours longer than you thought possible. The cold mountain air doesn't bite as sharply. For a moment, you feel almost divine yourself. This was coca in its purest form. A tool, a medicine, a sacred tradition woven into the fabric of an entire civilization. The Inca weren't getting high in the way we think of it today. They were surviving, they were enduring, and they were doing it with the help of a leaf that would, centuries later, bring the world to its knees. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 1530s, led by Francisco Pizarro, they encountered a civilization more advanced in many ways than their own. The Inca had roads that put European infrastructure to shame. They had agricultural techniques that maximized food production in impossible terrain. They had a postal system so efficient that messages could travel hundreds of miles in just days, carried by relay runners called chasquis who sustained themselves on, you guessed it, coca leaves. At first, the Spanish didn't understand coca. They saw the natives chewing these leaves and thought it was barbaric, maybe even demonic. The Catholic Church initially condemned coca as the work of the devil, a tool used by indigenous priests to communicate with false gods. Spanish missionaries tried to ban it outright. But then something shifted. The Spanish realized they had a problem. They'd conquered the Inca Empire, stolen mountains of gold and silver, and now they needed labor to extract even more wealth from the mines of Potosi, which would become the richest silver mine in human history. The problem was that the indigenous people they'd enslaved kept dying. The work was brutal beyond comprehension. Miners would descend into the earth for days at a time, breathing toxic dust, hauling ore in darkness, many of them never seeing the sun again. And here's the cold, brutal calculation the Spanish made. They noticed that miners who chewed coca could work longer, complain less, and survive marginally longer than those who didn't. So the Catholic Church suddenly changed its tune. Coca wasn't demonic after all. No, it was a useful plant, a gift that allowed these poor Indians to serve God and Spain more effectively. The Church even started taxing coca. By the late 1500s, 10% of the Catholic Church's revenue in Peru came from taxes on coca leaves. Let that sink in for a moment. The same institution that had called it devil worship was now making a fortune off it. The Spanish created massive coca plantations. They forced indigenous people to cultivate the plant in industrial quantities. Coca became currency in some parts of the Andes. Miners were often paid partially in coca leaves because the Spanish knew the miners needed it just to survive the hellish conditions they'd been forced into. It was a closed loop of exploitation. Create unbearable working conditions, provide the substance that makes those conditions barely tolerable, profit from both the labor and the substance. Sound familiar? It should, because this pattern will repeat throughout our story. For 3 centuries, coca remained largely confined to South America. Europeans knew about it, but they didn't care much. It was a curiosity, something exotic that the natives used. A few leaves made their way to Europe, preserved in botanical collections, but nothing significant happened. Coca was still just a leaf, still just a plant, still relatively innocent in the grand scheme of things. But in the background, chemistry was evolving, science was advancing, and in the mid-1800s, everything changed. The year was 1855. The place was Göttingen, Germany. A graduate student named Friedrich Geek was working in a laboratory, trying to isolate the active ingredient in coca leaves. Scientists had known for decades that something in the coca plant caused its effects, but nobody had successfully extracted it in pure form. Geek succeeded. He isolated a crystalline substance, an alkaloid which he called Erythroxylum. He'd created the first crude form of cocaine, though he didn't fully understand what he'd done. 4 years later, another German chemist named Albert Niemann improved on Geek's work. Niemann refined the extraction process, created a purer form of the alkaloid, and gave it a new name, cocaine. He noted in his research that when he touched his tongue to the crystals, it went numb. This numbing effect would later make cocaine valuable as a local anesthetic, but in 1859 was just an interesting observation in a chemistry paper that almost nobody read. Here's where the story accelerates. For about 20 years, cocaine remained an academic curiosity, but in the 1870s and 1880s, everything exploded, and I mean everything. Multiple forces converged at once. Pharmaceutical companies started mass-producing cocaine. Doctors started prescribing it for everything under the sun. Entrepreneurs started putting it in consumer products. And the scientific community, especially in Europe and America, became absolutely obsessed with it. One of the most influential early advocates was a Corsican chemist named Angelo Mariani. In 1863, Mariani created a tonic wine called Vin Mariani, which was basically Bordeaux wine infused with coca extract. The advertising claimed it restored health, strength, energy, and vitality. Mariani wasn't subtle about it either. His ads featured testimonials from celebrities, artists, politicians, even the Pope. Pope Leo XIII supposedly carried a flask of Vin Mariani and awarded Mariani a gold medal for his contribution to humanity. Thomas Edison drank it. Queen Victoria drank it. Ulysses S. Grant drank it while dying of throat cancer, claiming it helped him finish his memoirs. Vin Mariani contained approximately 6 milligrams of cocaine per fluid ounce. People were drinking multiple glasses a day. Do the math. The global elite were consistently, daily, dosing themselves with cocaine, and they loved it. They praised it. They wrote letters thanking Mariani for his miraculous invention. This wasn't underground. This wasn't illegal. This was high society medicine. Then things got even wilder. In 1884, a young Austrian doctor named Sigmund Freud got his hands on some cocaine. Yeah, that Freud, the father of psychoanalysis. Freud was struggling at the time, working at the Vienna General Hospital, making almost no money, trying to make a name for himself in the scientific community. He'd heard about cocaine's stimulant effects and decided to experiment on himself. Freud loved it, absolutely loved it. He started taking cocaine regularly and documented his experiences in a series of papers collectively known as Uber Coca. He praised cocaine as a miracle drug that could cure depression, anxiety, digestive problems, morphine addiction, alcoholism, even sexual dysfunction. He called it a magical substance, a cure-all, and he encouraged his friends, colleagues, and patients to try it. Freud was basically the first celebrity cocaine advocate, writing enthusiastically about how it made him feel focused, energetic, confident, and capable of incredible mental work. He wasn't entirely wrong about some effects. Cocaine does create feelings of euphoria, increased energy, and mental alertness, at least initially, but Freud missed or ignored the darker side. He gave cocaine to a close friend named Ernst Fleschl von Marxow, who was suffering from terrible pain due to an old injury. Freud thought cocaine might help Fleschl get off morphine. Instead, Fleschl developed a severe cocaine addiction, started experiencing terrifying hallucinations, and deteriorated rapidly. Freud watched his friend spiral into madness and death, and quietly backed away from his enthusiastic cocaine advocacy. By the 1890s, Freud stopped writing about cocaine altogether, though he likely continued using it privately for years. The damage, or rather the momentum, was already done. Freud's papers had been read by doctors all over Europe and America. Cocaine was now seen as legitimate medicine, endorsed by respected scientists. Pharmaceutical companies ramped up production. By the 1880s, you could buy cocaine in dozens of forms: powders, tablets, injections, nasal sprays, lozenges, you name it. Drugstores sold cocaine products over the counter, no prescription needed, right next to aspirin and cough syrup. And then in 1886, an American pharmacist named John Stith Pemberton created something that would become more famous than any medical tonic. Pemberton was a Confederate veteran, wounded in the Civil War, who'd become addicted to morphine while trying to manage his pain. He was always tinkering with formulas, trying to create the next miracle cure. He'd already made a coca wine similar to Vin Mariani, but Atlanta had recently passed prohibition laws, so he needed a non-alcoholic version. Pemberton mixed coca leaf extract with cola nut extract, which contains caffeine, added some sugar, caramel coloring, and other flavorings, and created a syrup that he mixed with carbonated water. He called it Coca-Cola. The name wasn't subtle. It literally advertised two of its main ingredients, coca and cola. Early Coca-Cola contained approximately 9 milligrams of cocaine per glass. The advertising called it the temperance drink, a healthy alternative to alcohol that would cure your headache, relieve fatigue, and provide intellectual refreshment. Think about that for a second. One of the most recognizable brands in human history, a drink that's now sold in virtually every country on Earth, started out as a cocaine delivery system. People weren't just sipping Coca-Cola for refreshment. They were getting dosed with a stimulant every time they drank it, and they came back for more, again and again, because it made them feel good in a way they couldn't quite explain. Pemberton sold his formula before he died in 1888, never seeing what his creation would become. The company that bought it, eventually led by a businessman named Asa Griggs Candler, turned Coca-Cola into an empire. By the 1890s, Coca-Cola was everywhere in America. Soda fountains served it. Advertisements plastered it on buildings, people swore by it, and nobody thought twice about the fact that they were consuming cocaine with their lunch. If you're enjoying this journey through history, if you're fascinated by how a simple plant became an empire unto itself, do me a favor and hit that like button. Let me know you're out there, drifting off to sleep while your mind absorbs these incredible truths. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do that now. We've got hours of content like this, designed specifically for people who want to learn while they rest. Trust me, you'll want to be here for what comes next. Meanwhile, the medical community was going absolutely wild with cocaine. Doctors were prescribing it for everything: hay fever, toothaches, depression, fatigue, even for children who seemed too shy or withdrawn. Parents would give their kids cocaine lozenges to help them perform better in school. Dentists used cocaine as a local anesthetic during procedures, which actually was a legitimate use, since cocaine numbs tissue effectively. But nobody was paying attention to the side effects, or if they were, they didn't care. People using cocaine regularly started exhibiting strange behaviors. They became paranoid. They couldn't sleep. They lost weight. Some developed holes in their nasal septums from snorting cocaine powder. Others experienced heart problems. A few died suddenly from what we now know were cocaine-induced heart attacks or strokes. And here's the thing, addiction wasn't really a concept people understood yet. The medical establishment in the late 1800s didn't have a framework for understanding why some substances caused compulsive use. They thought willpower was the issue. If you kept using cocaine despite negative effects, well, that was a moral failing on your part, not a problem with the drug itself. But slowly, very slowly, the tide started to turn. By the early 1900s, reports of cocaine-related problems were piling up. Doctors started seeing patients who'd become completely dependent on cocaine, who couldn't function without it, who'd lost their jobs, their families, their minds. Newspapers began running stories about cocaine fiends, painting dramatic, often racist pictures of cocaine users as dangerous and unpredictable. This is where the story gets dark in a different way, because the campaign against cocaine in America became deeply intertwined with racism. In the early 1900s, newspapers, especially in the South, ran sensationalistic stories claiming that black men were using cocaine and becoming violent, attacking white women, immune to bullets. These stories were almost entirely fabricated racist propaganda designed to stoke fear and justify violence against black communities. But they worked. They turned public opinion against cocaine, not because of actual medical evidence, but because of manufactured racial panic. In 1914, the United States passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, which regulated and taxed the production and distribution of cocaine and opiates. It didn't outright ban cocaine, but it made it much harder to obtain legally. Doctors could still prescribe it, but recreational use was effectively criminalized. By 1920, cocaine was largely removed from over-the-counter products. Coca-Cola had already removed cocaine from its formula in 1903, replacing it with more caffeine and other flavorings. though they still used decockinized coca leaf extract for flavor, which they do to this day. So by the 1920s, cocaine had gone from miracle medicine to public enemy in just a few decades. But here's the crucial thing: the demand didn't go away. People who'd gotten used to cocaine, who'd become dependent on it, didn't just stop wanting it because it became illegal. And where there's demand, someone will always step up to supply, no matter the risk. The stage was set. Cocaine had been pushed underground, but it was about to explode back into public consciousness in a way that would make the patent medicine era look quaint. For several decades after cocaine was criminalized in the United States and Europe, it faded somewhat from public view. The 1920s through the 1950s saw cocaine use decline dramatically. It was still around, still used in certain circles: jazz musicians, bohemian artists, high society folks who had connections, but it wasn't mainstream. Cocaine was expensive, hard to get, and had a reputation as a dangerous drug. The world moved on to other substances. Alcohol, which was briefly prohibited, came back strong. Amphetamines, which were legal and pharmaceutical grade, became popular with soldiers, truck drivers, and housewives. Cocaine became almost a historical footnote. But in the mountains of Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, coca farming never stopped. Indigenous communities continued cultivating coca for traditional use, chewing the leaves the same way their ancestors had for thousands of years. The plants grew wild in some areas. Small-scale operations processed coca into paste and cocaine for export, but it was still relatively small-time, disorganized, nothing like what was coming. The 1960s and 70s changed everything. Let's talk about what happened. American culture underwent massive transformations. The counterculture movement embraced drug experimentation as a form of rebellion against conservative values. Marijuana, LSD, and other psychedelics became popular, especially among young people protesting the Vietnam War and questioning authority. In that context, cocaine started making a comeback, but this time it was different. Cocaine in the 1970s became associated with wealth, success, and glamour. It wasn't a street drug for the desperate. No, it was the drug of choice for Wall Street traders, Hollywood celebrities, rock stars, and fashion models. It was expensive, roughly $100 a gram in an era when that was serious money, which made it a status symbol. If you could afford cocaine, you were successful. If you had access to high-quality cocaine, you were connected. It became woven into the fabric of elite culture in a way that's hard to overstate. Studio 54, the legendary New York nightclub, became famous partly because cocaine flowed through it like champagne. Celebrities would disappear into the VIP rooms and emerge hours later, euphoric and energized, ready to dance until dawn. The music industry ran on cocaine. Albums were recorded by artists who hadn't slept in days, fueled entirely by lines of white powder. Wall Street traders used cocaine to work longer hours, make bolder bets, push harder. The 1980s, greed is good mentality was, in many ways, a cocaine mentality. But here's the thing about demand. When demand skyrockets, supply rushes to meet it, and that's where Colombia enters the story in a massive way. Colombia had all the right ingredients for cocaine production. The coca plants grew well there, especially in rural areas where government control was weak. The country had a history of smuggling, well-established routes for moving contraband like emeralds and marijuana. There were plenty of impoverished farmers willing to grow coca because it paid better than coffee or bananas. And crucially, there were ambitious, ruthless men willing to organize the whole operation into something resembling a multinational corporation. In the 1970s, several groups in Colombia started coordinating cocaine production and trafficking. They'd buy coca paste from farmers in Peru and Bolivia, process it into cocaine hydrochloride in hidden labs, and then smuggle it into the United States through a variety of routes. Small planes, boats, hidden compartments in commercial shipments, mules carrying drugs and luggage, you name it. Early on, these groups were loose confederations, partnerships of convenience. But in the late 1970s and early 1980s, something crystallized. The Medellin cartel formed, and it changed the game entirely. The Medellin cartel wasn't just a drug trafficking organization. It was an empire, a parallel government, a multinational corporation structured with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company, but the brutality of a military dictatorship. And at the center of it all was a man named Pablo Escobar. Now, I want you to understand something. Pablo Escobar is one of the most fascinating and terrifying figures in modern history, and his story is so extreme that if you heard it as fiction, you'd think it was too over the top to be believable, but every bit of it is real. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was born in 1949 in Riongro, Colombia, a small town outside Medellin. His family was poor, lower middle class at best. His mother was a school teacher. His father was a farmer. There was nothing in Pablo's childhood that screamed future billionaire drug lord. But Pablo was smart, charismatic, and absolutely, utterly without moral limits when it came to making money. As a teenager, Pablo got into petty crime. He stole cars, sold contraband cigarettes, sold fake lottery tickets. He allegedly even stole gravestones, sandblasted off the names, and resold them. By his early 20s, Pablo was involved in kidnapping, holding wealthy Colombians for ransom. He was good at crime. He had a talent for it, an instinct for seeing opportunities that others missed. In the mid-1970s, Pablo shifted to cocaine. He started small, working as a smuggler for other traffickers, moving product from Colombia to the United States. But Pablo was ambitious in a way that's hard to overstate. He didn't want to work for someone else. He wanted to control everything: production, processing, transportation, distribution. He wanted to be the Coca-Cola of cocaine, a vertically integrated operation that controlled every step from the coca field to the American consumer's nose. And he did it. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, Pablo built an empire. He recruited pilots, bought planes, established airstrips in remote areas. He paid off police, judges, politicians, anyone who could be bought. For those who couldn't be bought, he offered a simple choice: plata o plomo, silver or lead, bribe or bullet. Take the money and cooperate, or take a bullet and die. Most people took the money. Pablo's Medellin cartel became phenomenally successful. By the mid-1980s, they were smuggling multiple tons of cocaine into the United States every single week. Not month, week. The cartel had an estimated 80% market share of the cocaine entering the US. Pablo was making so much money that it became a logistical problem. He spent thousands of dollars a month on rubber bands just to hold cash together. He lost billions of dollars to rats eating currency stored in warehouses, and he didn't care because there was always more money coming in. Forbes magazine listed Pablo Escobar as one of the richest men in the world, with an estimated fortune of over $30 billion at his peak. $30 billion from selling powder. He bought mansions, ranches, planes, even a private zoo filled with exotic animals. He built an estate called Hacienda Naples that had its own airport, lakes, sculptures, and hippos. Yeah, hippos. Pablo smuggled hippos from Africa to Colombia, and they're still there today, decades after his death, breeding in the wild, a bizarre living legacy of his insanity. But Pablo wasn't just a businessman, he was a monster. The violence he unleashed on Colombia is hard to comprehend. When judges tried to prosecute cartel members, Pablo had them assassinated. When journalists wrote critical stories, Pablo had them killed. When politicians refused to cooperate, Pablo bombed them. In 1989, the cartel planted a bomb on Avianca Flight 203, killing all 107 people on board, just to try to kill one politician who wasn't even on the plane. Think about that level of callous brutality. Over 100 innocent people dead, and Pablo didn't lose a minute of sleep over it. Pablo waged war against the Colombian government. He funded guerrilla groups. He financed terrorist bombings in Bogotá and other cities. He even offered to pay off Colombia's entire national debt, roughly $10 billion, in exchange for immunity from extradition to the United States. The Colombian government, understandably, refused. But here's the twisted part. In Medellin, Pablo was a hero to many poor people. He built soccer fields, housing for the poor, schools, and hospitals. He handed out money to families who needed it. He positioned himself as a Robin Hood figure, stealing from the rich Americans who bought his cocaine and giving to the poor Colombians who suffered under government neglect. People loved him for it. When Pablo walked through poor neighborhoods, crowds cheered. Children wanted to grow up to be like him. This is the complexity of Pablo Escobar. He was simultaneously a mass murderer and a philanthropist, a terrorist and a folk hero, a man who brought unimaginable suffering and also genuine help to people who had nothing. Trying to understand Pablo in simple good or evil terms is impossible. He was both somehow at the same time. While Pablo ran Medellin, another cartel was rising in Cali, a city in southwestern Colombia. The Cali cartel, led primarily by the Rodriguez Orjuela brothers, Gilberto and Miguel, took a different approach. Where Pablo was flashy and violent, the Cali cartel was quiet and corporate. They preferred bribing over killing, infiltration over confrontation. They called themselves the Gentlemen of Cali and looked down on Pablo's chaos. But make no mistake, the Cali cartel was just as ruthless. They just did it with better public relations. At one point, the Cali cartel had infiltrated Colombia's presidential campaign, the national police, the military, and even helped fund the groups hunting Pablo Escobar. They were playing chess while Pablo played checkers, and for a while it looked like their strategy was smarter. The two cartels hated each other. They fought brutal wars, bombing each other's labs, assassinating each other's associates, bribing officials to betray the other side. Hundreds of people died in the crossfire. Colombia became one of the most dangerous places on Earth, with violence so widespread that people just accepted it as normal. Car bombs were routine. Assassinations were daily news. The government was on the verge of collapse. And all of this, every bit of it, was fueled by American demand for cocaine. Every line snorted at a Manhattan party, every gram sold in a Los Angeles club, every hit smoked in Miami, translated directly into money flowing south to Colombia, and that money bought guns, bombs, and corrupted governments. I need you to pause and really think about that connection. The casual recreational drug use happening in wealthy American cities had a direct causal link to children being orphaned by car bombs in Bogota. That's not hyperbole. That's the reality of the cocaine trade. Demand doesn't exist in a vacuum. Every market has consequences, and in this case, the consequences were measured in body counts. By the early 1990s, the Colombian government, with massive support from the United States, went to war against the Medellin cartel. A special police unit called the Search Block, funded and trained by the DEA and CIA, hunted Pablo relentlessly. A vigilante group called Los Peps, which stood for people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, though it was likely funded in part by the Cali cartel and elements of the Colombian government, started killing Pablo's associates, bombing his properties, and targeting his family. Pablo went on the run, hiding in safe houses, constantly moving, paranoid and isolated. His empire was crumbling. Associates were being arrested or killed. His money, while still vast, was harder to access. The man who'd once been untouchable was now the most hunted criminal on Earth. On December 2, 1993, Pablo made a mistake. He stayed on a phone call too long trying to talk to his son. The Search Block triangulated his location, surrounded the house and stormed in. Pablo tried to escape across the rooftops. He was shot multiple times and killed. The photos of his body, lying on a tile roof in a middle-class neighborhood, were broadcast around the world. The king was dead. But cocaine didn't die with Pablo, not even close. The death of Pablo Escobar in 1993 didn't end the cocaine trade. It didn't even slow it down. What it did was change the structure, shift the power dynamics, and if anything, make the whole operation more efficient and more widespread. Cali cartel immediately moved to fill the vacuum left by the Medellin cartel's collapse. For a few years in the mid-1990s, the Rodriguez-Orjuela brothers and their associates controlled an estimated 70–80% of the world's cocaine supply. They ran it like a corporation, complete with distribution networks, marketing strategies, and even customer service. They diversified their smuggling routes, investing in submarines, semi-submersibles, and sophisticated tunnels. They infiltrated legitimate businesses, using everything from fruit export companies to flower industries as fronts for moving cocaine. But the Cali cartel's success was also their downfall. Their size made them a target. The Colombian government, still under intense pressure from the United States, went after them with the same determination they'd used against Pablo. One by one, the Cali leadership was arrested. Gilberto Rodriguez Orjuela was captured in 1995. Miguel followed in 1996. Other key leaders fell in quick succession. And again, the cocaine trade didn't stop. It just adapted. What happened next was a fragmentation. Instead of one or two massive cartels controlling everything, the cocaine trade splintered into hundreds of smaller organizations. Some were still based in Colombia, but increasingly, trafficking shifted to Mexico. Mexican cartels, which had previously worked as junior partners smuggling Colombian cocaine into the United States, saw an opportunity and seized it. The Mexican cartels were vicious. Groups like the Tijuana cartel, the Juarez cartel, the Gulf cartel, and eventually the Sinaloa cartel became the new powers in cocaine trafficking. They controlled the crucial border crossing points into the United States, and they charged Colombian producers a fee, a tax essentially, for every kilogram that crossed into American territory. Eventually, many Mexican cartels cut out the Colombians entirely, dealing directly with coca producers in Peru and Bolivia, processing the cocaine themselves, and controlling the entire supply chain from source to street. And the violence got worse, much worse. Mexican cartels made Pablo Escobar look restrained by comparison. They pioneered new levels of brutality. Public beheadings, bodies hung from bridges, mass grave massacres of rival gang members and their families, torture methods so horrific that I won't describe them here because this is supposed to help you sleep, not give you nightmares. Between 2006 and 2020, an estimated 150,000 to 250,000 people died in Mexico's drug war. Entire cities became battlegrounds. Journalists who reported on the cartels were murdered. Mayors and police chiefs who tried to fight back were assassinated, often along with their families. The Mexican government deployed the military to fight the cartels, but the cartels often outgunned them, using military-grade weapons, armored vehicles, even grenade launchers and rocket-propelled grenades. And Americans, for the most part, didn't see any of it. They saw cocaine as a party drug, something fun and relatively harmless, something sophisticated people did on weekends. The The connection between their recreational use and the chaos in Mexico and Colombia was invisible, or at least easy to ignore. By the 2000s and 2010s, cocaine had gone through yet another transformation. It was no longer just the drug of the rich. The introduction of crack cocaine in the 1980s, which we'll talk about in detail in a moment, had already made cocaine accessible to poorer communities. But by the 2000s, powder cocaine prices had dropped due to increased supply. Cocaine was everywhere: cities, suburbs, rural areas, wealthy neighborhoods, and poor ones. The DEA and other law enforcement agencies tried everything to stop it. They intercepted shipments, arrested traffickers, extradited cartel leaders to the United States, where they couldn't bribe their way out of supermax prisons. They sprayed coca fields with herbicides in Colombia, trying to kill the plants at the source. They trained foreign militaries and police forces. They spent billions of dollars on what they called the war on drugs. And yet cocaine kept flowing. For every shipment intercepted, 10 more got through. For every cartel leader arrested, a dozen younger, hungrier, more violent lieutenants fought for the chance to take over. The economic incentives were just too strong. As long as Americans and Europeans wanted cocaine, someone would supply it, no matter the risk. But let's rewind for a moment and talk about something crucial. Crack cocaine, because that's a whole different level of the story, and it changed America in ways we're still grappling with today. In the early 1980s, someone, and it's not entirely clear who, figured out a simple chemical process. If you take cocaine hydrochloride, the powder form, mix it with baking soda and water and heat it, the cocaine base precipitates out and hardens into rocks when it cools. These rocks can be smoked, and when you smoke them, the cocaine hits your brain in seconds, producing an intense, immediate, overwhelming high that's much more powerful than snorting powder. They called it crack, named after the crackling sound it makes when it burns. Crack was a game changer for all the wrong reasons. Powder cocaine was expensive. A gram might cost $100, which meant it was mostly accessible to middle-class and wealthy users. But crack could be sold in tiny doses, $5 or $10 rocks, making it affordable to anyone. You could get high on crack for less than the cost of a six-pack of beer. Crack hit American cities like a plague. Los Angeles, New York, Miami, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia. Every major urban area saw crack explode in the mid-1980s. And it devastated poor communities, especially black neighborhoods, in a way that's hard to overstate. Here's why crack was so destructive. First, it's intensely addictive, more addictive than powder cocaine. More addictive than almost anything else available on the street at the time. The high from crack lasts only about 5 to 10 minutes, which means users need to smoke it again and again to maintain the feeling. People would smoke crack in binges, going through dozens of rocks in a single session, staying awake for days, depleting their bank accounts, selling everything they owned, just chasing that next hit. Second, crack destroyed families. Parents who became addicted to crack would abandon their children, spend grocery money on drugs, disappear for days on end. Children grew up in homes where crack was more important than food. The term crack baby entered the national vocabulary, referring to infants born to mothers who'd smoked crack during pregnancy. These Barbies often had health problems, developmental delays, and faced stigma from day one, though later research showed that many of the problems attributed to prenatal crack exposure were actually due to poverty, malnutrition, and lack of prenatal care, rather than the drug itself. Third, crack fueled violence. The crack trade was competitive and brutal. Street-level dealers fought for territory, for customers, for respect. Guns flooded into neighborhoods along with crack. Young men, teenagers really joined gangs that controlled crack distribution, and they killed each other at astonishing rates. Drive-by shootings became common. Innocent bystanders, children playing in parks, people sitting on their porches, got caught in crossfire. The murder rate in major American cities skyrocketed. In New York City, the homicide rate hit over 2,000 murders a year in 1990. Washington, D.C. became known as the murder capital of America, with 482 murders in 1991 in a city of only about 600,000 people. Los Angeles, Detroit, New Orleans all saw similar spikes. Most of the victims were young black men, killed by other young black men, usually over crack territory or crack debts. And here's where the story gets even darker, because the government's response to crack was completely different from its response to powder cocaine. In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. The law said that possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine triggered a mandatory 5-year prison sentence. But to get the same sentence for powder cocaine, you'd need to possess 500 grams. That's a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity. Think about what that means. Someone caught with a small amount of crack, the cheap version used predominantly in poor black neighborhoods, got the same sentence as someone caught with 100 times more powder cocaine. the expensive version used predominantly by wealthy white people. This wasn't accidental. This was policy, enacted with broad bipartisan support, signed by President Reagan, and it had predictable, devastating consequences. Hundreds of thousands of people, mostly black men, went to prison for crack offenses. Families were torn apart. Communities that were already struggling lost an entire generation of young men to incarceration. By the 1990s and 2000s, the United States had the highest incarceration rate in the world, and drug offenses, particularly crack-related offenses, were a major driver. Meanwhile, wealthy white cocaine users rarely faced the same consequences. They got treatment programs, second chances, understanding from judges who saw them as good kids who made mistakes. Poor black crack users got decades in federal prison. The racial disparity was so obvious, so blatant, that even people who supported tough-on-crime policies had to acknowledge it, though it took decades before anything changed. The sentencing disparity was finally reduced to 18-1 in 2010 with the Fair Sentencing Act, and even that modest reform was controversial. The crack epidemic also gave us something else: the militarization of American police. As crack spread, police departments started adopting military tactics and equipment. SWAT teams, which had been relatively rare, became standard in cities across the country. No-knock raids became common. Police started using battering rams, flashbang grenades, armored vehicles, all in the name of fighting drugs. And it didn't work. Crack use remained high throughout the late 1980s and 1990s. The violence continued. The incarceration rate exploded, but drugs were still everywhere. You could arrest every dealer on a corner, and the next day new dealers would be there, because the economic incentive was too strong. A young man in a poor neighborhood could make more money selling crack in a week than he could make in a month working minimum wage, assuming he could even find a job. The risk of arrest or death was high, sure, but when you're living in poverty with no opportunities, when your future looks bleak no matter what you do, those risks start to seem acceptable. Let me paint you a picture of what this looked like on the ground. Imagine you're growing up in South Central Los Angeles in 1988. You're 14 years old. Your mother works 2 jobs but still can't make rent. Your father left years ago. Your older brother is in prison for a drug offense. Your school is underfunded, overcrowded, and half your teachers seem to have given up. The building is falling apart, textbooks are decades old, and there's no money for programs or extracurriculars. You walk home from school, and on every corner you see guys your age, maybe a few years older, wearing nice clothes, gold chains, new sneakers. They're dealing crack. They've got money. They've got respect, or at least fear, which looks like respect when you're 14. They drive nice cars. Girls pay attention to them. They offer you a chance to make some money. Just hold this package. Just stand on this corner. Just make a delivery. What do? The right choice is to say no. Stay in school, work hard, hope that somehow you'll make it out of poverty through education and legitimate work. But you've seen how that works out. Your mother works constantly and is still broke. Your teachers don't seem to believe in you. The legitimate economy has nothing to offer you except minimum wage at a fast food restaurant if you're lucky. The wrong choice is to take the money, to get involved in the drug trade, to accept the risks because at least there's a chance at something better. At least there's money now today that can help your mother pay rent, that can get you the things that make you feel like you matter. Thousands of young people faced this choice, and many of them made the wrong choice, not because they were bad people, but because the system had failed them so completely that the wrong choice looked like the only rational option. And the crack epidemic wasn't just an American problem. Crack spread to Europe, to South America, to the Caribbean. Wherever cocaine went, crack followed, and it brought the same devastation. Addiction, violence, incarceration destroyed communities. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, crack use started to decline in the United States, not because the war on drugs worked, but because communities adapted. People saw what crack did to their neighbors, their families, their friends, and they rejected it. A cultural shift happened. Crack became stigmatized even within communities that had been hit hardest by it. Younger generations saw the damage and made different choices. But the damage was done. Millions of people had been incarcerated. Thousands had died. Communities had been hollowed out. And the cocaine trade, the powder cocaine that created crack in the first place, continued as strong as ever. If you're still with me, still listening to this incredible and tragic history, I want to ask you something. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you think about this story so far. Tell me if there are other historical topics you'd like us to explore in this same deep, detailed way. Your engagement helps us know what content to create next. And honestly, it's good to know people are out there, learning and thinking about these complex issues. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Dreamless Timelines. We're just getting started, and the best is yet to come. Now, let's talk about how governments responded to all of this, because the war on drugs became one of the defining policy initiatives of the late 20th century, and its consequences are still playing out today. The phrase war on drugs was popularized by President Richard Nixon in 1971, though the concept of using law enforcement to control drug use goes back much further. Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one and dramatically increased federal funding for drug control agencies. But it was really Ronald Reagan in the 1980s who turned the war on drugs into a full-scale military-style campaign. Reagan came into office in 1981 with a tough-on-crime message that resonated with voters who were scared of rising crime rates and social disorder. His wife, Nancy Reagan, launched the Just Say No campaign, which became one of the most recognizable anti-drug campaigns in history. The message was simple: drugs are bad, don't do them, just say no. It was plastered on billboards, in schools, on television. Celebrities recorded public service announcements. Athletes told kids to stay drug-free. It was well-intentioned, but it was also simplistic and largely ineffective. Telling teenagers to just say no doesn't address the underlying reasons people use drugs: poverty, trauma, peer pressure, mental health issues, lack of opportunity. It's like telling someone who's drowning to just swim harder. But the Reagan administration didn't just rely on slogans. They dramatically increased funding for law enforcement, for interdiction efforts, for building prisons. The federal drug control budget increased from about $1.5 billion in 1981 to over $6.6 billion in 1989. States followed suit, passing tougher sentencing laws, building more prisons, hiring more police. The strategy had several components. First, interdiction: try to stop drugs at the source or in transit. The Coast Guard intercepted boats carrying cocaine. Customs agents searched cargo at ports. The DEA worked with foreign governments to destroy coca fields and cocaine labs. The US government even considered using military force against cartels, though they usually stopped short of that. Second, domestic enforcement: arrest dealers and users. Police departments created specialized narcotics units. They conducted undercover operations, used informants, made thousands of arrests. Federal prosecutors charged major traffickers under RICO statutes, seizing their assets, aiming to destroy their organizations. Third, prevention and education. The Just Say No campaigns, DARE programs in schools, which taught kids about the dangers of drugs. DARE became ubiquitous in American schools, with police officers coming into classrooms to teach students to resist drugs. Fourth, treatment. Though this got far less funding than enforcement, there were programs designed to help addicts recover. The results were mixed at best, and catastrophic at worst, depending on how you measure success. On one hand, the war on drugs did disrupt some trafficking organizations. Major cartel leaders were arrested or killed. Significant quantities of cocaine were seized. Some coca fields were destroyed. But on the other hand, the war on drugs failed spectacularly at its stated goal of reducing drug use and availability. Cocaine remained widely available throughout the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s. Prices dropped, indicating increased supply. Purity increased, meaning the cocaine getting to users was stronger. The cartels adapted to every law enforcement tactic, finding new routes, new smuggling methods, new ways to launder money. And the unintended consequences were enormous. The mass incarceration we talked about earlier, that was a direct result of war on drugs policies. By 2010, the United States had about 2.3 million people in prison, roughly 5 times more than in 1980. About 500,000 of those were incarcerated for drug offenses. That's more people in prison for drugs than were in prison for all reasons in 1980. These weren't kingpins or cartel leaders. Most people in prison for drug offenses were low-level dealers or users, people who posed no violent threat to society. They were disproportionately Black and Hispanic, even though drug use rates were similar across racial groups. A young Black man was far more likely to be arrested, convicted, and given a harsh sentence for a drug offense than a young white man caught with the same drugs. This created a cycle. Young men went to prison, which made it harder for them to find jobs when they got out, which pushed them back toward illegal activity, which led to rearrest. Communities lost entire generations of potential workers, fathers, and leaders. Children grew up with parents in prison, which increased their likelihood of ending up in the criminal justice system themselves. The economic costs were staggering. It costs roughly $30,000 to $40,000 per year to incarcerate someone in the United States. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of prisoners serving long sentences for drug offenses, and you're looking at tens of billions of dollars spent annually, money that could have gone to education, treatment programs, economic development in struggling communities, infrastructure, literally anything else. Meanwhile, in the countries where cocaine was produced, the war on drugs had its own set of consequences. The United States pushed hard for eradication programs, spraying coca fields with herbicides like glyphosate, The idea was to destroy the supply at its source. If you kill the coca plants, you can't make cocaine. But this devastated rural farming communities. Coca was often the only crop that could grow reliably in certain areas and the only crop that paid enough to support a family. When fields were destroyed, farmers lost their livelihoods. Some replanted coca in more remote areas. Others joined guerrilla groups or criminal organizations because they had no other options. The policy created more instability, more violence, without significantly reducing cocaine production. In Colombia, the situation became incredibly complex. The government was fighting multiple wars simultaneously, against the cartels, against left-wing guerrilla groups like FARC and ELN, and against right-wing paramilitary groups. All of these factions were involved in the cocaine trade to some degree, using drug money to fund their operations. The United States poured billions of dollars into Plan Colombia, a massive aid package that included military equipment, training, and support. Plan Colombia had some successes. The Colombian government regained control of areas that had been dominated by guerrillas and cartels. Cocaine production in Colombia declined, at least temporarily. Security improved in major cities. But production just shifted. When Colombia cracked down, production increased in Peru and Bolivia. It's called the balloon effect. Squeeze one part of the balloon and it bulges out somewhere else. The overall global cocaine supply didn't decrease, it just moved around. And the violence didn't stop. It shifted to Mexico, as we discussed earlier. Mexican cartels became more powerful, more brutal, and Mexico descended into a horrific drug war that continues to this day. Tens of thousands of people have died, disappeared, or been displaced by cartel violence. The war on drugs also had profound effects on civil liberties in the United States. In the name of fighting drugs, police were given broader powers. Asset forfeiture laws allowed police to seize property suspected of being connected to drug activity, even without convicting anyone of a crime. People lost their homes, cars, and bank accounts, and had to fight in civil court to get them back, often unsuccessfully. No-knock raids became more common, leading to tragic mistakes where police raided the wrong house or encountered armed homeowners who thought they were being burglarized. Innocent people died in these raids, including children. Drug testing became standard in many workplaces and schools, raising questions about privacy and the presumption of innocence. The Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures was eroded in the name of drug enforcement. By the 2000s and 2010s, a growing number of people, including some law enforcement officials, judges, and politicians who'd once supported the war on drugs, started saying it had failed. They pointed to the mass incarceration, the racial disparities, the continued availability of drugs, the violence in Mexico and Central America, the billions spent with little to show for it. Some cities and states started trying different approaches. Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001, treating drug use as a public health issue rather than a criminal one, and saw decreases in overdoses, HIV infections, and drug-related crime. Other countries experimented with harm reduction strategies, needle exchange programs, supervised injection sites, medication-assisted treatment for addiction. In the United States, some states began legalizing marijuana, which wasn't the focus of our story but was part of the broader war on drugs. The sky didn't fall. Tax revenue increased. Arrests decreased. It showed that maybe, just maybe, there were alternatives to the punitive approach that had dominated for decades. But cocaine remained illegal everywhere, and for good reason. Cocaine is genuinely dangerous. It's highly addictive. It causes serious health problems, heart attacks, strokes, respiratory failure, psychiatric issues. It destroys lives and families. Nobody's arguing that cocaine is harmless or should be freely available. The question is whether the current approach, criminalization and incarceration, is the best way to deal with it, or whether there are smarter, more humane, more effective strategies. And while that debate continues, the cocaine trade keeps evolving, keeps adapting, keeps finding new markets and new methods. Let's talk about what the cocaine trade looks like today, in 2025, because it's more sophisticated, more widespread, and more resilient than ever before. First, production. Global cocaine production has reached record levels. According to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, coca cultivation and cocaine production have been increasing steadily over the past decade. Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia remain the primary producers, with Colombia alone accounting for roughly 70% of global production. The cartels and trafficking organizations have become incredibly sophisticated. They use submarines, yes, actual submarines, custom-built to smuggle multi-ton loads of cocaine underwater, undetectable by most radar and surveillance. Some are fully submersible, requiring crews to navigate underwater for days. Others are semi-submersibles, riding just below the surface. These submarines cost millions of dollars to build, but a single successful trip can carry cocaine worth hundreds of millions, making it worth the investment. They use drones to fly cocaine over borders, especially the US-Mexico border. They build elaborate tunnels under the border, some equipped with lighting, ventilation, and rail systems. They hide cocaine in shipping containers mixed with legitimate cargo: bananas, coffee, flowers, car parts, anything. They've sewn cocaine into the lining of clothes, molded it into the shapes of furniture, dissolved it in liquids, and later extracted it. They use encrypted communications, cryptocurrency for transactions, complex money laundering schemes involving shell companies, real estate, art, and legitimate businesses. Modern trafficking organizations employ accountants, lawyers, IT specialists, logistics experts. They're multinational corporations that happen to traffic in illegal substances. And they've expanded their markets. Europe has become a major consumer of cocaine, with usage rates in some countries matching or exceeding those in the United States. The United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands all have significant cocaine markets. Cocaine has spread to Australia, where it's extremely expensive due to the difficulty of smuggling it there, sometimes costing $300 or more per gram. Cocaine has even made inroads in Asia, traditionally not a major market for the drug. Trafficking organizations have found routes through West Africa, using countries with weak governance as transit points, and from their shipping to Europe and beyond. The cartels have also diversified. Many trafficking organizations now move multiple types of drugs: cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, fentanyl, marijuana. They're involved in other criminal enterprises too: extortion, kidnapping, human trafficking, arms dealing, illegal mining. They're more like organized crime conglomerates than simple drug cartels. In Mexico, the violence has continued and in some ways worsened. The Sinaloa cartel, once led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman before his arrest and extradition to the United States, remains one of the most powerful. But it's faced challenges from the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG, which has grown rapidly and violently, challenging the Sinaloa cartel's dominance. These organizations have corrupted entire governments. In some Mexican states, the cartels effectively control local police, politicians, and judges. They collect taxes from businesses, provide social services that the government doesn't, and run parallel governments. It's not an exaggeration to say that in parts of Mexico, the cartels are the government. The violence is staggering. In 2019, Mexico recorded over 34,000 homicides, one of the highest rates in the world. Many of these were cartel-related: executions, massacres, battles between rival groups. Mass graves have been discovered containing hundreds of bodies. Journalists, activists, and politicians who speak out against the cartels are killed with alarming regularity. And yet, cocaine keeps flowing north. Despite all the interdiction efforts, all the arrests, all the seizures, cocaine remains readily available in every major American city. The DEA estimates that the cocaine market in the United States alone is worth tens of billions of dollars annually. But here's something interesting: cocaine use patterns have shifted. The stereotype of cocaine as a rich person's drug has become less accurate. Cocaine is now used across socioeconomic classes, though the forms and contexts differ. Powder cocaine is still popular in nightclubs, among professionals in party scenes, but cocaine use has also increased in rural areas, among working-class people, often alongside opioid use. And crack, while less prevalent than during the epidemic of the 1980s and 90s, hasn't disappeared. It's still used in many urban areas, still causing addiction and health problems, though it gets less media attention now than the opioid crisis. Speaking of which, the opioid crisis has in some ways overshadowed cocaine in public consciousness. The United States is dealing with an epidemic of opioid overdoses, driven first by prescription painkillers, then by heroin, and most recently by fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that's incredibly potent and deadly. Hundreds of thousands of Americans have died from opioid overdoses in the past 2 decades. This has changed the drug landscape. Many trafficking organizations now focus on fentanyl, which is easier to produce and transport than cocaine or heroin. You can make fentanyl in a lab anywhere, whereas cocaine requires coca plants grown in specific climates. Fentanyl is so potent that a kilogram can be diluted into hundreds of thousands of doses, making it extremely profitable. But cocaine hasn't gone away. In fact, cocaine overdose deaths have been increasing, partly because cocaine is increasingly cut with fentanyl, often without users knowing. Someone expecting to snort a line of pure cocaine might unknowingly ingest fentanyl, which can cause a fatal overdose, especially since cocaine users typically don't have opioid tolerance. This has created a new public health crisis. Harm reduction advocates push for drug checking services, where people can test their drugs to see what's actually in them. Naloxone, a medication that reverses opioid overdoses, is now carried by many first responders and even some recreational drug users, because you never know when someone might overdose on fentanyl-laced cocaine. The legal landscape is also shifting. Some jurisdictions are experimenting with decriminalizing possession of small amounts of drugs for personal use. Oregon passed a ballot measure in 2020 decriminalizing possession of all drugs in small quantities, treating it as a civil violation rather than a crime, though the implementation has been rocky and controversial. There's growing recognition that addiction is a health issue, not a moral failing, and that treatment is more effective than incarceration. But there's still significant political opposition to major drug policy reform, especially around cocaine and other hard drugs. Meanwhile, the environmental impact of cocaine production is becoming clearer. Coca cultivation drives deforestation in the Amazon and other sensitive ecosystems. Farmers clear rainforests to plant coca, destroying biodiversity and contributing to climate change. The chemicals used to process coca into cocaine, precursors like sulfuric acid, acetone, and kerosene, are often dumped directly into rivers, poisoning water supplies and killing aquatic life. Cocaine production also funds armed groups that engage in illegal mining and logging, further damaging the environment. In some ways, every gram of cocaine consumed is linked not just to human suffering, but to environmental destruction. And still, despite all of this, despite the violence, the addiction, the incarceration, the environmental damage, the corruption, cocaine use continues. Why? Because the fundamental dynamics haven't changed. There's demand, there's supply, and there's enormous profit in connecting the two. Take a moment and breathe deeply. Let your body relax into whatever surface you're resting on. We've covered a lot of ground, journeyed through centuries of history, through jungles and cities, through laboratories and courtrooms. The story of cocaine is vast and complex, and we're not quite done yet. If you're finding value in this deep dive, in this thorough exploration of history that most people never learn, do me a favor and leave a comment. Tell me what surprised you most. Tell me what you want to learn about next. Your engagement matters. It helps us create better content, and it builds our community of curious, thoughtful people who want to understand the world better. Let's talk about something that often gets lost in discussions of drug policy, cartel violence, and law enforcement: the individual human beings whose lives have been destroyed by cocaine. Think about the coca farmer in Colombia, living in a remote rural area where the government barely exists. He's been growing coca for years because it's the only crop that pays enough to feed his family. Coffee prices crashed. Bananas don't grow well in his region. But coca always has a buyer. The local trafficking organization pays cash on time, no questions asked. This farmer doesn't see himself as part of a global criminal enterprise. He's just trying to survive, trying to send his kids to school, trying to keep his family from starving. But he's at risk every day. The government might spray his fields with herbicides, destroying his livelihood. Rival trafficking groups might try to take over his area, leading to violence. He might be caught and arrested, even though he's just a farmer, not a trafficker. His children grow up in a world where cocaine is normal, where everyone in the community depends on it for survival. Some of those children will become involved in trafficking themselves, because what other opportunities do they have? It's a generational trap, a cycle that's almost impossible to break. Now think about the street-level dealer in an American city. Maybe he's 19 years old, grew up in poverty, dropped out of high school because he needed to help his mother pay rent. He started dealing cocaine or crack because it was the only way to make real money. He's not getting rich. Most street dealers make less than minimum wage when you calculate their hourly earnings, and that doesn't account for the risk of arrest, imprisonment, or death. This young man might have wanted to be something else, might have had dreams, talents, potential, but he was born into circumstances that made those dreams almost impossible. Every day he risks being arrested, which would destroy any chance he has of eventually getting a legitimate job. He risks being killed by rival dealers or by police. He's traumatized by violence he's witnessed or participated in. He might use drugs himself to cope with the stress and trauma of his life. If he's arrested, and statistically he probably will be at some point, he'll go to prison. Maybe for years, maybe for decades under mandatory minimum sentences. His 20s, 30s, the years when he should be building a career, starting a family, contributing to society, will be spent in a cell. When he gets out, he'll have a felony record, making it nearly impossible to find employment. What do you think he'll do then? Many people in that situation end up right back in the drug trade, because it's the only option they see. Now think about the user, the person who buys cocaine to use recreationally. Maybe she's a 30-year-old professional, a lawyer or a marketing executive or a doctor. She works hard, makes good money, and uses cocaine occasionally at parties or on weekends to unwind, to feel confident and energetic, to have fun. She doesn't think of herself as part of the problem. She's not hurting anyone, right? It's her body, her choice, her money. She's not stealing or committing crimes. She's just having a good time. But the cocaine she uses has a history. It was produced in Colombia or Peru, processed with chemicals, smuggled through multiple countries, passing through the hands of cartels that engage in horrific violence. People died to get that cocaine to her. The money she pays for it funds criminal organizations that terrorize entire communities. The demand she creates, multiplied by millions of people like her, sustains the entire industry with all its attendant suffering. She probably knows this intellectually, but it's easy to compartmentalize, to not think about it, to see it as someone else's problem. And if she's honest with herself, she's probably not entirely in control of her use. She tells herself she can stop anytime, that it's not a problem, that she's just using it recreationally. But is she? Does she feel anxious when she knows she won't have access to cocaine? Does she spend more money on it than she planned? Does she use it more often than she intended? Cocaine is insidious that way. It doesn't create the kind of obvious physical addiction that, say, heroin does. You don't get sick from cocaine withdrawal in the same way, but it creates a psychological dependency that can be just as powerful. You remember how good it made you feel, how confident, how energetic, how social. And normal life, sober life, starts to feel a little dull by comparison. So you use again, and eventually you're using not to feel good, but to feel normal, to not feel the depression and anxiety that come from regular cocaine use. If her use escalates, if she becomes truly addicted, her life can fall apart quickly. Cocaine addiction can lead to paranoia, aggression, heart problems, strokes, seizures. It can destroy relationships, careers, financial stability. She might lose her job, her home, her family. She might end up in the criminal justice system, despite her privilege and resources. Or maybe she never reaches that point. Maybe she uses cocaine occasionally for years without major problems, at least not problems she recognizes. But the hidden cost, the cost to people she'll never meet in countries she'll never visit, continues to accrue. Now think about the families of people killed in cartel violence. Think about a woman in Mexico whose husband, a journalist, was murdered for reporting on cartel activity. She's left alone to raise their children, traumatized, frightened, economically struggling. Her kids grow up without a father, with the knowledge that speaking out against injustice can get you killed. Think about the mother in inner-city Baltimore, whose son was shot in a dispute over crack territory when he was 16. She'll never see him graduate, never see him get married, never meet his children. She's left with grief, rage, and unanswered questions about how society failed her son so completely that he saw drug dealing as his best option. Think about the child in Peru whose parents are in prison for cocaine trafficking, who's being raised by grandparents, who's growing up in poverty, who carries the stigma of having parents in prison for a crime that much of the world sees as glamorous or victimless. These are the human costs of cocaine, the costs that don't show up in statistics about tonnage seized or arrests made. These are real people whose lives have been irrevocably damaged by a substance that started as a sacred leaf in the Andes and became a global scourge. And here's the thing that's hardest to grapple with. There's no simple solution. You can't just legalize cocaine and expect the problems to disappear. Cocaine is genuinely harmful, genuinely addictive, but prohibition clearly hasn't worked either. It's created violence, mass incarceration, and enriched criminal organizations without significantly reducing use or availability. Some people advocate for harm reduction, making drug use safer without necessarily trying to eliminate it. This includes things like drug testing services, so users know what they're taking, supervised consumption sites where people can use drugs under medical supervision, ready access to naloxone and other overdose reversal medications, needle exchange programs to prevent disease transmission. Others advocate for decriminalization or legalization with regulation, treating drugs as a public health issue rather than a criminal one, taxing and regulating them like alcohol or tobacco. Still, others believe that the root causes need to be addressed: poverty, lack of opportunity, trauma, mental health issues. If people had better options, they'd be less likely to use drugs problematically or to get involved in trafficking. The truth is probably that we need all of these approaches simultaneously: prevention, treatment, harm reduction, sensible law enforcement that focuses on violent crime rather than simple possession, addressing socioeconomic inequality, international cooperation to reduce production and trafficking without creating humanitarian crises in producing countries. But implementing all of that requires political will, significant resources, and a fundamental shift in how society thinks about drugs and drug users. And that's hard. It's easier to fall back on simplistic, just say no messages or tough on crime posturing than to grapple with the messy, complex reality of drug policy. Meanwhile, people keep using cocaine, farmers keep growing coca, cartels keep trafficking, Police keep arresting, prisons keep filling, and the cycle continues year after year, decade after decade. A seemingly endless loop of supply and demand, crime and punishment, suffering and profit. Let's take a moment to understand what cocaine actually does to the brain, because understanding the pharmacology helps explain why cocaine is so addictive and why the problem is so persistent. Cocaine is a stimulant, meaning it increases activity in the central nervous system. When you consume cocaine, whether by snorting, smoking, or injecting it, it enters your bloodstream and quickly crosses the blood-brain barrier, reaching your brain within seconds to minutes depending on the route of administration. Once in the brain, cocaine interferes with the normal functioning of neurotransmitters, particularly dopamine, but also serotonin and norepinephrine. Let's focus on dopamine because it's key to understanding addiction. Dopamine is often called the pleasure chemical, but that's a bit misleading. Dopamine is more accurately described as the motivation and reward chemical. Your brain releases dopamine when you do things that are important for survival: eating, having sex, achieving a goal, experiencing something novel and exciting. Dopamine creates a feeling of pleasure and satisfaction, but more importantly, it teaches your brain to remember and seek out the behaviors that led to that dopamine release. Normally, after dopamine is released into the synapse, the space between neurons, it's reabsorbed by the neuron that released it through structures called dopamine transporters. This reuptake process regulates dopamine levels, keeping them balanced. Cocaine blocks these dopamine transporters. It prevents the reuptake of dopamine, causing it to accumulate in the synapse. This means dopamine levels in certain brain circuits, particularly the reward pathway called the mesolimbic pathway, increase dramatically, much more than they would from natural rewards like food or sex. The result is an intense feeling of euphoria, energy, confidence, and well-being. Users describe feeling invincible, incredibly focused, like they can accomplish anything. It's an artificial flood of pleasure that far exceeds anything evolution designed the brain to experience. But here's the problem. When you artificially flood your brain with dopamine repeatedly, your brain adapts. It's called neuroadaptation. Your brain essentially says, whoa, there's way too much dopamine here, we need to compensate. So it does several things. It reduces the number of dopamine receptors, making the brain less sensitive to dopamine. It reduces natural dopamine production. It strengthens the reuptake process to clear dopamine more quickly. These adaptations mean that over time, you need more cocaine to get the same effect. That's tolerance. And when you're not on cocaine, your dopamine system is depleted and dysfunctional, which leads to depression, anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure from normal activities, fatigue, and intense cravings for cocaine. This is the neurological trap of addiction. The things that used to make you happy, a good meal, time with friends, accomplishments at work, don't stimulate enough dopamine anymore because your brain has been recalibrated to cocaine's massive dopamine surges. The only thing that feels good is cocaine, so you use again and again, and each time you're reinforcing the neural pathways that associate cocaine with reward, making the addiction stronger. Cocaine also affects other brain systems. It increases norepinephrine, which raises heart rate, blood pressure, and alertness. This is why cocaine can cause heart attacks and strokes, especially in people with underlying cardiovascular problems. The increased blood pressure can cause blood vessels to burst or form clots. Cocaine affects serotonin, which influences mood, sleep, and appetite. This is partly why cocaine users often experience mood swings, insomnia, and loss of appetite. Chronic cocaine use causes structural changes in the brain. Brain imaging studies show that long-term cocaine users have reduced gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and judgment. They have altered white matter, which affects how different brain regions communicate with each other. These changes can persist for months or years after someone stops using cocaine, though some recovery is possible with abstinence. Cocaine addiction also involves learned associations. Your brain learns to associate certain people, places, things, and emotions with cocaine use. These become triggers. Someone who always used cocaine at parties might experience intense cravings when they're in a similar social setting, even months or years after quitting. Someone who used cocaine to cope with stress might crave it intensely whenever they feel stressed, even if they've been clean for a long time. This is why addiction treatment often focuses on identifying triggers and developing coping strategies. It's not enough to just stop using cocaine. You have to rewire your brain's learned associations, develop new coping mechanisms, and often change your entire lifestyle to avoid triggers. Now, it's important to note that not everyone who uses cocaine becomes addicted. Addiction is complex and involves multiple factors: genetics, environment, mental health, trauma history, age of first use, frequency and route of administration, and social support. Some people have genetic variations that make them more or less susceptible to addiction. Some people have co-occurring mental health issues like depression, anxiety, ADHD, or PTSD, and they use cocaine to self-medicate, which increases addiction risk. People who experience childhood trauma are at higher risk for addiction. People who start using drugs in adolescence, when the brain is still developing, are more vulnerable to addiction. The route of administration matters too. Smoking crack or injecting cocaine produces a faster, more intense high than snorting powder cocaine, and faster, more intense highs are more addictive because they create stronger associations in the brain's reward system. But even with all these risk factors, addiction isn't inevitable. Many people use cocaine occasionally without developing a disorder. The question is, why take the risk? Because once addiction takes hold, it's incredibly difficult to overcome. Treatment for cocaine addiction is challenging because, unlike opioid addiction, there's no medication that can substitute for cocaine or block its effects. Methadone and buprenorphine exist for opioid addiction. Naltrexone can block opioid effects, but for cocaine, we don't have equivalent medications, though researchers are working on it. Treatment usually involves behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy to identify and change thought patterns and behaviors associated with drug use, contingency management, which provides rewards for staying drug-free, motivational interviewing to enhance someone's motivation to change, and group therapy for peer support. Residential treatment programs remove people from their drug-using environment and provide intensive therapy, structure, and support. 12-step programs like Cocaine Anonymous provide ongoing peer support. But relapse rates are high. Even with good treatment, many people relapse, sometimes multiple times before achieving sustained recovery. This doesn't mean treatment doesn't work. It means addiction is a chronic, relapsing disorder, similar to diabetes or hypertension. People with these conditions sometimes have setbacks and need to adjust their treatment. The same is true for addiction. Recovery is possible. People do get clean and stay clean. They rebuild their lives, repair relationships, find purpose and meaning. But it takes tremendous effort, support, and often multiple attempts. Understanding the neuroscience of addiction also helps explain why punishment-focused approaches to drug policy are ineffective. You can't punish someone out of addiction. Addiction is a brain disorder, not a moral failing. Threatening someone with prison doesn't fix the neurological changes that drive compulsive drug use. This isn't to say people shouldn't be held accountable for their actions. If someone commits crimes to support their addiction, there need to be consequences. But those consequences should include treatment, not just punishment. Studies consistently show that treatment is more effective than incarceration at reducing drug use and recidivism. Yet our policies often don't reflect this understanding. We still incarcerate hundreds of thousands of people for drug offenses, often without providing adequate treatment. We release them back into the same environments that contributed to their addiction, with even fewer resources and opportunities than before, and then we're surprised when they use again. It's a system that sets people up to fail, and then blames them for failing. Let's talk about money, because ultimately, the cocaine trade exists because it's insanely profitable. The economic chain of cocaine is fascinating and horrifying. At the beginning, you have the coca farmer. In Colombia, Peru, or Bolivia, a coca farmer might receive about $500 to $1,000 per kilogram of coca paste, the semi-processed form that comes from soaking coca leaves in chemicals and drying them. It takes roughly 370 kilograms of coca leaves to produce 1 kilogram of coca paste, and 1 hectare of coca plants produces roughly 2,000 to 4,000 kilograms of leaves per year, depending on conditions. So the farmer, growing coca on a hectare of land, might make $3,000 to $6,000 per year. That's not much, but it's often more than they could make growing legal crops, which is why they do it despite the risks. The coca paste is sold to processors who refine it into cocaine base, and then into cocaine hydrochloride, the white powder. This processing requires various chemicals and some expertise. The processors might sell the finished cocaine to traffickers for $1,000 to $3,000 per kilogram, depending on purity and location. Now the trafficking organizations take over. They smuggle the cocaine out of South America, which involves significant costs and risks: transportation, bribes, losses from seizures. By the time cocaine reaches Mexico or Central America, the price has increased to maybe $5,000 to $10,000 per kilogram. Smuggling cocaine across the US-Mexico border adds more cost and risk. By the time cocaine reaches a distribution hub in the United States, like Los Angeles, Miami, or Houston, the price has jumped to $15,000 to $30,000 per kilogram. From there, it moves to regional distributors who break down the kilogram quantities into smaller amounts and distribute them to mid-level dealers. At this level, the price per kilogram might be $30,000 to $50,000. Finally, it reaches street-level dealers who sell directly to users. They cut the cocaine with inert substances, sometimes caffeine, lidocaine, or levamisole, a veterinary deworming agent that's sometimes added to cocaine and can cause serious health problems. By cutting it, they increase the volume and their profit margin. At the street level, cocaine typically sells for $50 to $100 per gram in the United States, depending on quality and location. That means 1 kilogram, by the time it's been cut and sold on the street, generates roughly $100,000 to $150,000 in revenue. Think about that markup. The farmer got maybe $500 for the coca paste that went into that kilogram. The in-street value is $100,000 or more. That's a markup of about 20,000%. The vast majority of that profit goes to the trafficking organizations, the people who control the smuggling and distribution networks. This is why the cocaine trade is so hard to stop. The profit margins are enormous, which means the incentives to participate, despite the risks, are incredibly strong. Even if law enforcement seizes 10% of cocaine shipments, which is roughly the estimated interdiction rate, traffickers still make huge profits on the 90% that gets through. And the demand is relatively inelastic, meaning that even if prices increase due to increased law enforcement, demand doesn't decrease proportionally. People who are addicted to cocaine will find a way to buy it even if it gets more expensive. They'll spend more of their income on it or commit crimes to get the money, but they won't just stop using because the price went up. The money generated by the cocaine trade is staggering. Estimates vary, but the global cocaine market is worth somewhere between $100 billion and $300 billion annually. To put that in perspective, that's comparable to the GDP of some countries. It's more than the annual revenue of many Fortune 500 companies. And all of that money is untaxed, unregulated, and largely controlled by criminal organizations. They have to launder it, convert it from cash into assets that appear legitimate. Money laundering is an industry unto itself. Drug traffickers use numerous methods to launder money. They might open legitimate businesses, restaurants, car washes, retail stores, and run drug money through them, making it look like business revenue. They might buy real estate, paying in cash or through shell companies. They might invest in art, jewelry, or other valuable assets. They might use trade-based money laundering, manipulating international trade transactions to move value across borders. Banks, despite regulations requiring them to report suspicious activity, sometimes facilitate money laundering, either through negligence or corruption. Several major international banks have been fined billions of dollars for laundering drug money, though critics argue the fines are just a cost of doing business and don't provide sufficient deterrent. Cryptocurrency has created new money laundering opportunities. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies can be used to move value across borders without going through traditional banking systems. While blockchain technology creates a permanent record of transactions, it's difficult to link those transactions to real-world identities, especially if users take precautions. The economic impact of the cocaine trade extends beyond the traffickers' profits. There's the cost of law enforcement, police, prisons, courts, all the resources devoted to fighting the drug trade. There's the cost of healthcare for people dealing with addiction and drug-related health problems. There's the lost economic productivity when people are incarcerated or struggling with addiction instead of working and contributing to the economy. There's also the economic damage to countries plagued by drug-related violence. Tourism suffers, foreign investment decreases, talented people leave if they can, corruption undermines economic institutions, the rule of law breaks down, making it harder for legitimate businesses to operate. In Mexico, the economic cost of drug-related violence has been estimated at 1–2% of GDP annually. That's money not being invested in education, infrastructure, healthcare, economic development. Yet despite all these costs, despite all the efforts to stop it, the cocaine trade continues because the fundamental economic incentives haven't changed. There's demand in wealthy countries, there's supply in poor countries, and the profit from connecting the two is enormous. Some economists argue that legalization and regulation could address this by eliminating the black market premium. If cocaine were legal and regulated like alcohol, the price would drop dramatically because you'd eliminate the risk premium associated with smuggling and selling an illegal product. Tax revenue could fund treatment programs and offset some of the social costs. But legalization faces enormous political and practical obstacles. Many people, understandably, don't want to see cocaine legalized because it's dangerous and addictive. There are legitimate concerns that legalization could increase use, at least initially. There are international treaty obligations. The UN drug conventions that most countries have signed require them to criminalize cocaine. So we're stuck in a kind of stalemate. Prohibition doesn't work well, but the alternatives are politically unpalatable or practically difficult to implement. And while we debate, the trade continues, the violence continues, the addiction continues, and the money continues to flow. It's impossible to tell the story of cocaine without talking about its presence in popular culture, because cocaine has been romanticized, glamorized, and mythologized in ways that have shaped public perception and arguably driven demand. Let's start with the disco era of the 1970s. Cocaine became inextricably linked with disco culture, with clubs like Studio 54 in New York becoming legendary for their cocaine-fueled parties. Celebrities, musicians, models, and socialites would gather in these spaces, and cocaine was everywhere, openly used, almost celebrated as a symbol of the era's excess and hedonism. The 1970s cocaine culture was captured in movies like Saturday Night Fever and Looking for Mr. Goodbar, in songs by artists like Eric Clapton, whose song Cocaine became an anthem despite being intended as a warning, and in the general aesthetic of the era: glamorous, excessive, artificial. The 1980s took it even further. This was the decade of excess, of greed being good, of conspicuous consumption. Cocaine fit perfectly into this cultural moment. Wall Street traders used it to work longer hours and take bigger risks. The financial industry in the 80s had a notorious cocaine problem, captured in movies like Wall Street and books like Liar's Poker. The music industry in the 80s ran on cocaine. Rock stars, pop stars, hip-hop artists, almost everyone in music either used cocaine or knew people who did. Some artists died from it. John Belushi in 1982, from a combination of cocaine and heroin. Others, like Robert Downey Jr., struggled with very public addiction battles that derailed their careers for years. Hollywood romanticized cocaine in countless films. Scarface in 1983 became a cultural touchstone, with Al Pacino's Tony Montana becoming an antihero, a violent drug lord who many people, especially in hip-hop culture, admired despite or perhaps because of his ruthlessness. The famous line, "Say hello to my little friend," and the image of Tony surrounded by mountains of cocaine became iconic. Blow in 2001 told the story of George Jung, an American cocaine smuggler who worked with the Medellin cartel. The film portrayed Jung sympathetically, as a guy who just wanted to make money and live the American dream, who got caught up in something bigger than he expected. It glossed over the violence and suffering caused by the cocaine trade he was part of. Narcos, the Netflix series that premiered in 2015, told the story of Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel. It was wildly popular, making Escobar into a complex, almost sympathetic character. Wagner Moura's portrayal of Escobar showed him as a loving father and husband, a man who cared about poor people, someone with a code and principles, even as he ordered brutal murders. This cultural glamorization has real consequences. When young people see drug dealers portrayed as powerful, wealthy, respected, even heroic figures in movies and TV shows, it shapes their perceptions. When they hear rappers bragging about cocaine dealing in songs, when they see celebrities talking casually about cocaine use, it normalizes it, makes it seem cool, exciting, transgressive in an appealing way. Hip-hop in particular has had a complicated relationship with cocaine. In the 1980s and 90s, many rappers came from communities devastated by crack. Artists like NWA, Public Enemy, and Tupac Shakur talked about the destruction crack caused, the violence, the police brutality that came with the war on drugs, the mass incarceration of black men. But other rappers, particularly in the 2000s and beyond, celebrated cocaine dealing as a hustle, a way to escape poverty, a source of money and power. Artists like Jay-Z, Notorious B.I.G., and Rick Ross, who took his stage name from Freeway Rick Ross, a real cocaine dealer, talked about their past involvement in drug dealing. And while they often acknowledged the dangers and consequences, they also portrayed it as a rational choice given their circumstances. This created a cultural contradiction. Cocaine was simultaneously destroying communities and being celebrated as a path to success. Young people received mixed messages: drugs are bad and will ruin your life, but also, look at all these successful people who dealt drugs and got rich. The reality, of course, is that for every Jay-Z who successfully transitioned from drug dealing to legitimate business success, there are thousands of people in prison or dead, but those stories don't make for exciting songs or movies. Cocaine has also been referenced constantly in comedy. From Richard Pryor joking about freebasing cocaine in the 1980s, despite nearly dying when he set himself on fire while freebasing, to Pineapple Express and other stoner comedies that treat drug use as harmless fun, cocaine and drugs generally have been a rich source of material for comedians. Sometimes the comedy serves as a form of social commentary, highlighting the absurdity of drug policy or the hypocrisy of the war on drugs. Other times, it's just making light of something serious, which some people find problematic. Cocaine has appeared in literature too, from Hunter S. Thompson's gonzo journalism in the 1970s, which openly discussed his drug use, to novels like Less Than Zero by Bret Easton Ellis, which portrayed wealthy Los Angeles teenagers using cocaine with a kind of detached, nihilistic attitude, to Roberto Saviano's 000, a journalistic investigation of the global cocaine trade that was later adapted into a TV series. Even video games have featured cocaine. Grand Theft Auto, Vice City prominently featured cocaine dealing as part of its 1980s Miami setting. Scarface, The World Is Yours let players take on the role of Tony Montana. These games were controversial, with critics arguing they glorified drug dealing and violence, while defenders said they were just reflecting reality and providing adult entertainment. The cumulative effect of all this cultural representation is that cocaine has become embedded in our collective consciousness in specific ways. It's seen as glamorous, associated with wealth and success. It's seen as relatively safe, at least compared to other drugs. It's seen as a party drug, something recreational, not as serious as heroin or meth. These perceptions don't match the reality of cocaine's dangers and the devastation the cocaine trade causes, but perceptions shape behavior. If people think cocaine is relatively harmless, they're more likely to try it. If they associate it with success and glamour, it becomes aspirational. The media also plays a role in shaping perceptions through news coverage. During the crack epidemic, news media ran sensationalistic stories about crack Barbies, welfare queens, and super predators, often using racist language and imagery that demonized black users and dealers. This coverage helped justify harsh sentencing laws and militarized policing in black communities. Meanwhile, when cocaine use among wealthy white people was discussed, it was often treated more sympathetically, framed as a health issue or a personal struggle, rather than a crime problem requiring harsh punishment. This racial disparity in media coverage mirrored and reinforced the racial disparities in the criminal justice system. It's another example of how cocaine, throughout its history, has been entangled with issues of race, class, and power. As you lay there, processing all of this information, all of this history, I want you to think about how culture shapes our understanding of substances, of crime, of justice. Think about how the stories we tell ourselves, through movies and music and news media, create narratives that can either clarify reality or obscure it. If you're getting something out of this journey, something valuable, something that makes you think differently, consider subscribing to Dreamless Timelines if you haven't already. We're trying to create content that goes deep, that respects your intelligence, that doesn't shy away from complexity. And your support, your subscription, your likes and comments, that's what allows us to keep doing this. So where does this story go from here? What does the future hold for cocaine, for drug policy, for the communities affected by the cocaine trade? There are several possible trajectories, and the truth is that nobody knows for certain which path we'll take. One possibility is that we continue on the current path: prohibition, law enforcement, interdiction, with incremental reforms around the edges. This is essentially the status quo, and we can predict the likely outcomes because we've seen them for decades. Cocaine will remain widely available despite law enforcement efforts. Trafficking organizations will continue to adapt and innovate. Violence will continue in producing and transit countries. Addiction and overdoses will continue. Incarceration will continue, though perhaps with some reduction as sentencing reforms slowly spread. This path is unsatisfying because it doesn't solve the fundamental problems, but it's also the path of least resistance politically. It doesn't require any major changes or controversial decisions. It's familiar, even if it's not particularly effective. A second possibility is escalation. Some politicians and law enforcement officials argue that we haven't been tough enough, that we need more resources, harsher penalties, more aggressive military intervention in drug-producing countries. This approach has been tried repeatedly and has generally made things worse, causing more violence without reducing drug availability, but it remains politically popular in some quarters. If we went down this path, we'd likely see more violence, more incarceration, more militarization of police, and possibly military conflicts in Latin America. We'd see civil liberties further eroded in the name of fighting drugs, and we still probably wouldn't significantly reduce cocaine use or availability because the fundamental economics wouldn't change. A third possibility is significant reform in the direction of harm reduction and decriminalization. This would involve treating drug use primarily as a public health issue rather than a criminal justice issue. It would mean decriminalizing possession of small amounts of drugs for personal use. investing heavily in treatment and prevention programs, implementing harm reduction strategies like drug checking services and supervised consumption sites, and focusing law enforcement resources on violent crime and large-scale trafficking, rather than low-level possession and use. Portugal implemented this approach in 2001 and saw positive results: decreases in overdose deaths, HIV infections, drug-related crime, and incarceration, with no significant increase in drug use. Several other countries and some US jurisdictions have moved in this direction. If the United States and other major consumer countries move significantly toward harm reduction and decriminalization, we'd likely see reduced incarceration, reduced strain on the criminal justice system, potentially better public health outcomes, and possibly less violence in producing countries as the profit margins for trafficking decreased somewhat. But this approach has limits. It doesn't address the supply side or the violence in producing and transit countries. It doesn't eliminate the black market or the criminal organizations that control it, and it faces significant political opposition from people who see it as being soft on drugs or giving up on preventing drug use. A fourth possibility, more radical and controversial, is legalization and regulation. This would mean treating cocaine similarly to how we treat alcohol or tobacco: legal for adults, regulated for purity and potency, taxed, with the revenue funding treatment and prevention programs, with advertising restrictions and age limits. The argument for legalization is that it would eliminate the black market, removing the enormous profits that drive criminal organizations. It would allow for quality control, reducing deaths from overdoses or contamination. It would free up law enforcement resources to focus on other crimes. It would reduce incarceration. It would generate tax revenue. The arguments against legalization are substantial too. Cocaine is dangerous and addictive. Legalization might increase use, at least initially, leading to more addiction and health problems. There are international treaty obligations that would need to be renegotiated. There would be thorny questions about how to regulate it, who can produce it, who can sell it, what potency is allowed, how do you prevent corporate marketing from encouraging excessive use? How do you prevent a new wave of addiction, particularly among vulnerable populations? No country has fully legalized cocaine, so we don't have a real-world example to study. Bolivia has legalized coca leaf for traditional use, but not cocaine. Some activists and scholars argue for legalization, but it remains far from mainstream policy. A fifth possibility involves international cooperation and development. If wealthy consumer countries invested significant resources in economic development in coca-growing regions, providing alternative livelihoods for farmers, improving education and infrastructure, strengthening legitimate economies, maybe coca cultivation would decrease. If the United States and Europe worked with Latin American countries as partners rather than dictating drug policy from afar, maybe we could find more effective, less violent approaches. This would require sustained commitment and resources, probably billions of dollars over many years. It would require patience, because economic development is slow. It would require respecting the sovereignty and priorities of Latin American countries rather than imposing solutions. And it would still require dealing with the demand side, because as long as people in wealthy countries want cocaine, someone will supply it. The reality is that the future probably involves some combination of these approaches. Different jurisdictions will try different things. Some will reform, some will double down on prohibition, some will experiment with new models. Over time, we'll learn what works and what doesn't, though works means different things to different people. If your priority is reducing drug use, you'll measure success differently than if your priority is reducing violence, or reducing incarceration, or protecting individual liberty. Different values lead to different policies. What seems clear is that the current approach isn't working well enough. After more than a century of drug prohibition, after decades of the war on drugs, cocaine is more available than ever. Cartels are more powerful than ever. We've incarcerated millions of people without significantly reducing drug use. We've spent hundreds of billions of dollars with limited return on investment. That doesn't necessarily mean legalization is the answer, but it does mean we should be willing to question our assumptions and try new approaches, even if they're uncomfortable or politically difficult. The science of addiction has advanced tremendously. We understand much better now how addiction works in the brain, how to treat it effectively, what risk factors make someone vulnerable. We have evidence from other countries that have tried different approaches. We have decades of data showing what doesn't work. We should use that knowledge. We should design policies based on evidence rather than ideology or political expediency. We should prioritize reducing harm. Both the harm drugs cause to individuals and the harm prohibition causes to communities. Technologically, the future might bring new challenges and opportunities. Synthetic drugs are becoming more common. Scientists have synthesized compounds that mimic cocaine's effects. As chemistry advances, it may become possible to create designer drugs that are legal because they're not specifically banned, but have similar effects to cocaine. This is already happening with synthetic cannabinoids and synthetic cathinons, often called bath salts. If synthetic cocaine substitutes become available, it could disrupt the traditional cocaine trade, but it would also create new public health challenges because these synthetic drugs are often more dangerous and unpredictable than the drugs they're designed to mimic. Artificial intelligence and big data might give law enforcement new tools for tracking and disrupting trafficking networks. But those same technologies could be used by traffickers to optimize their operations, avoid detection, and launder money more effectively. The bottom line is that cocaine, in one form or another, will probably be with us for the foreseeable future. The coca plant isn't going extinct. The demand for stimulants, for substances that make people feel energetic and euphoric and confident, isn't disappearing. The question is how we as a society choose to deal with that reality. Do we continue fighting a war we're not winning, accepting the violence, incarceration, and corruption as necessary costs? Do we try radically different approaches, accepting the risks and uncertainties involved? Do we find some middle path, incrementally reforming while maintaining the basic prohibition framework? These aren't easy questions, and reasonable people disagree about the answers. But the one thing we can't do is pretend the current situation is acceptable. Too many people are dying, too many communities are being destroyed, too much money is flowing to criminal organizations, too many people are in prison for non-violent offenses. The status quo is a slow-motion catastrophe, and we owe it to ourselves, to the people suffering in the cocaine trade, to at least try to imagine and work towards something better. Let me share some stories, real stories from real people whose lives have intersected with cocaine in various ways. These aren't composite characters or hypotheticals. These are real people, though I've changed names and details to protect privacy. Maria is a woman in her 50s who grew up in rural Peru. Her family had grown coca for generations, using it traditionally, chewing the leaves to deal with altitude and fatigue. When she was a child in the 1970s, traffickers came to her village offering to buy coca leaves for much more than anyone had paid before. Her father refused at first, not wanting to be involved in anything illegal. But their legal crops, mostly potatoes and corn, barely provided enough to eat. Eventually, economic necessity won out. Her father started selling coca leaves to the traffickers. The money changed their lives. They could afford better food, medical care when someone got sick, to send Maria and her siblings to school. For a few years, things were good. Then the violence started. Rival trafficking groups fought for control of the area. The Shining Path, a Maoist guerrilla organization, tried to control coca production to fund their insurgency. The Peruvian military came through, burning fields, arresting people. Maria's uncle was killed in a firefight between traffickers. Her older brother was arrested and spent years in prison, even though he was just a farmer. Maria eventually left, moving to Lima, then to the United States as an undocumented immigrant. She worked as a housekeeper, sent money home to her family. She got married, had children who grew up American, who barely speak Spanish and have no concept of the poverty and violence she escaped. She's never told them the full story of how their grandfather made a living, how their uncle died, why she came to America. She thinks about that sometimes, about how the cocaine that destroyed so many American families during the crack epidemic was related to the coca her father grew, even though she knows intellectually that the connection is distant and complex. She wonders if the Americans who bought that cocaine ever thought about people like her family, people just trying to survive. Then there's Michael, who grew up in Baltimore in the 1980s. Smart kid, loved reading, wanted to be a lawyer someday, but his neighborhood was being devastated by crack. His older brother started dealing when Michael was 12. His brother made more money in a week than their mother made in a month working at a grocery store. Michael saw what crack did to people. He saw users hollow-eyed and desperate. He saw violence, friends shot over corners and disrespect. He told himself he'd never get involved. But when he was 16, his mother got sick, needed medication they couldn't afford. His brother was in prison by then. Michael started dealing crack, telling himself it was temporary, just until his mother got better. Temporary became 2 years, became 5 years. Michael got good at it, moved up, started making real money. He was making so much that he forgot about college, about being a lawyer, about anything except the money and the respect that came with controlling a corner. He got arrested twice, got out, went right back to it because he didn't know how to do anything else and he needed the money. When Michael was 25, his best friend was shot and killed in front of him over a drug debt. Michael held him while he died, got covered in his blood and something broke inside him. He walked away from dealing that night, moved to a different city, started over with nothing. He worked construction, went to community college at night, got his GED, eventually got an associate's degree. Now he's in his 40s, works in social services, tries to help kids who are where he was, caught between poverty and the drug trade. He tells them his story, shows them his scars, literal and metaphorical. Some listen, some don't. He saves the ones he can and mourns the ones he can't. He thinks about his friend bleeding out on that sidewalk, about all the people he sold crack to, about the different person he might have become if he'd grown up somewhere else, somewhere with opportunities, somewhere safe. Then there's Jennifer, an investment banker in Manhattan. She first tried cocaine at a work party in her mid-20s. Everyone was doing it, senior partners, people she respected and wanted to emulate. It made her feel confident, energetic, like she could work all night and dominate the next day's meeting. So she did it again, and again. For years, Jennifer maintained what she thought was controlled use. She only used cocaine at parties or during particularly stressful work periods. She made a lot of money, got promoted, bought a nice apartment. She thought she had it under control. But gradually, it escalated. She started using alone, started using to cope with stress, anxiety, the pressure of her job, started using more frequently, spending hundreds of dollars a week on cocaine. Her work performance started to suffer despite the drug that was supposed to help. She made mistakes, missed deadlines, got into conflicts with colleagues. Jennifer's boyfriend left her, telling her she'd changed, that she was paranoid and aggressive. She lost weight, stopped sleeping properly, developed nosebleeds from snorting cocaine regularly. And still she kept using, because not using meant facing how out of control her life had become, and that was too terrifying. She hit bottom when she was arrested for possession. As a first-time offender with money for a good lawyer, she got probation and court-mandated treatment instead of jail time. Treatment was hard. She had to confront why she'd been using, the pressure she put on herself, the perfectionism, the fear of failure. She had to learn new coping mechanisms, new ways to deal with stress. Jennifer's been clean for 3 years now. She left investment banking, works in a less high-pressure field, makes less money but has a better life. She attends support group meetings. She thinks about cocaine sometimes, still craves it occasionally when she's stressed, but she's learned to ride out those cravings without giving in. She also thinks about privilege. She got treatment instead of prison because she's white, wealthy, and connected. She wonders what would have happened if she'd been poor, if she'd been black or Hispanic, if she'd been arrested with crack instead of powder cocaine. She probably would have gone to prison, and her life would have taken a completely different trajectory. That awareness stays with her, makes her conscious of how arbitrary justice can be, how your outcome depends so much on factors beyond your control: race, class, geography, luck. Let me tell you about Carlos, a police officer in Mexico City. Carlos joined the police force 20 years ago, idealistic, wanting to serve his community and fight crime. He quickly learned that the cartels controlled almost everything. They had more money, better weapons, and better intelligence networks than the police. Carlos saw colleagues accept bribes. He saw commanders who were on cartel payrolls. He saw good cops get killed when they refused to cooperate. Early in his career, Carlos was offered a choice: take money from the cartel and look the other way, or refuse and become a target. Carlos refused. He's survived 2 assassination attempts. He's been transferred multiple times for his own safety. His family lives in a different city under assumed names because of death threats. He makes barely enough money to support them. And still, he keeps showing up for work, keeps trying to do his job honestly, keeps fighting a battle he knows he's probably going to lose. He's arrested hundreds of people involved in drug trafficking over the years. Most of them were low-level, mules, street dealers, lookouts. The kingpins, the people who actually matter, they're untouchable, protected by corruption at the highest levels. Carlos has seen evidence against major traffickers disappear. He's seen witnesses murdered before they could testify. He's seen judges who were about to rule against cartel members suddenly reverse their decisions after receiving threats. Carlos is exhausted. He's in his 40s now, and he wonders how much longer he can keep doing this. He wonders if he's making any difference at all, or if he's just tilting at windmills while the cartels continue business as usual. He wonders what will happen to his country, whether the violence will ever end, whether there will be anything left to save by the time it does. But he keeps going because someone has to, because giving up feels like betraying everything he believes in. He's a hero, though nobody will probably ever know his name or what he sacrificed. Then there's David, an emergency room doctor in Miami. David has seen the full spectrum of cocaine's medical consequences. He's treated heart attacks in people in their 20s, healthy athletes whose hearts stopped because they did a line of cocaine before going to the gym. He's treated strokes in young professionals, previously healthy people who now have permanent brain damage. He's treated people in the grip of cocaine-induced psychosis, paranoid and hallucinating, convinced that everyone is trying to kill them. He's treated people seizing from cocaine overdoses, their bodies convulsing uncontrollably. He's treated people with holes in their nasal septums from years of snorting cocaine, the cartilage eaten away. He's pronounced people dead from cocaine overdoses, often young people, sometimes mixed with fentanyl they didn't know was there. He's had to tell parents that their child is dead from drugs. He's had to tell spouses that their partner isn't coming home. Those conversations never get easier, no matter how many times he has them. David also treats the violence. Gunshot wounds from drug deals gone wrong, stab wounds from fights over drug debts, assault victims beaten by people high on cocaine. He sees the ripple effects of the drug trade every single shift. But David also sees something else. He sees that most of his patients are decent people who made bad choices or got caught in bad situations. They're not monsters. They're humans who struggled with addiction or poverty or trauma, and drugs became a way to cope, and it destroyed them. He tries to treat them with compassion, to connect them with resources, to help them if they want help. He's frustrated by a system that treats addiction as a crime rather than a medical issue. He sees people arrested and sent to jail when they need treatment. He sees people released from jail without treatment or support, and they're back in his a month later with the same problems. It's a revolving door that helps no one. David advocates for policy changes when he can, writes letters to legislators, speaks at community meetings. But systemic change is slow, and people keep dying in the meantime. All he can do is keep showing up for his shifts, keep treating the patients in front of him, keep trying to save lives one at a time. These stories, Maria and Michael and Jennifer and Carlos and David, they represent just a tiny fraction of the millions of people whose lives have been touched by cocaine. Each person has their own story, their own complexity, their own mixture of choices and circumstances that brought them to where they are. It's easy to reduce the cocaine story to simple narratives: greedy criminals, weak addicts, corrupt officials, heroic law enforcement. But the reality is far more complex. Most people involved in the cocaine trade at every level are human beings trying to navigate difficult situations with limited options. That doesn't excuse the violence, the corruption, the harm caused. But it does mean that solutions need to address root causes, not just symptoms. We need to understand why people make the choices they make, what circumstances push them toward drugs or drug dealing, what alternatives we can provide. And we need empathy. We need to see the humanity in everyone involved, from the farmer growing coca to survive, to the addict struggling to get clean, to the cop trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation, to the doctor treating the casualties of the drug war. Without empathy, without understanding, we'll keep repeating the same mistakes, pursuing the same failed policies, expecting different results. While we've focused primarily on the Americas, particularly the United States, Colombia, and Mexico, cocaine's impact is truly global. Let's widen our lens and look at what's happening in other parts of the world. Europe has become a major cocaine market, with usage rates in some countries rivaling or exceeding those in the United States. The United Kingdom, Spain, and the Netherlands are particularly significant markets. Cocaine seizures in European ports have reached record levels in recent years, indicating massive flows of the drug into the continent. The trafficking routes to Europe are diverse. Some cocaine travels directly from South America to European ports, hidden in shipping containers. The port of Antwerp in Belgium, the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and ports in Spain are major entry points. Other routes go through West Africa, which has become a critical transshipment region. Countries like Guinea-Bissau, which is sometimes called a narco-state, have been essentially taken over by trafficking organizations. These are small, poor countries with weak governments and limited law enforcement capacity. Traffickers use them as bases to store cocaine before shipping it to Europe. The corruption is pervasive, with government officials on cartel payrolls, making it nearly impossible to address the problem. The impact on West Africa has been devastating. These countries, already struggling with poverty, corruption, and political instability, have been further destabilized by the drug trade. Violence has increased, corruption has worsened. Young men have been recruited into trafficking organizations, often with no understanding of the risks they're taking. In Europe itself, the cocaine trade has fueled gang violence, particularly in cities like Amsterdam, Antwerp, and various cities in the UK. Gangs fight for control of distribution networks. Violence that was once rare in these relatively safe European cities has become more common. There have been shootings, bombings, and assassinations linked to cocaine trafficking. European law enforcement has responded with increased efforts to intercept cocaine shipments and arrest traffickers, but they face the same challenge as American law enforcement. The economics of the trade make it nearly impossible to stop entirely. Australia is another interesting case. Australia is geographically isolated, making it difficult and risky to smuggle cocaine there. As a result, cocaine prices in Australia are among the highest in the world, sometimes $300 or more per gram. Despite the high prices, or perhaps because of them, cocaine use in Australia has been increasing. The high prices indicate strong demand despite the cost. Traffickers use various methods to get cocaine to Australia, concealing it in air cargo, using postal services to mail small quantities, employing drug mules who swallow condoms filled with cocaine and attempt to pass through customs, and using maritime routes with small boats or yachts. The Australian government has invested heavily in border security and drug interdiction, but Australia's vast coastline and limited resources make complete border control impossible. Cocaine continues to flow in, and the high prices make it extremely profitable for the traffickers who successfully get it through. In Asia, cocaine use has traditionally been lower than in the Americas or Europe, but it's been growing. China has seen increased cocaine use, particularly in wealthy urban areas. Japan has strict drug laws and relatively low drug use, but cocaine is present in elite circles. Southeast Asian countries have focused more on heroin and methamphetamine, but cocaine is making inroads. The Middle East has also seen growing cocaine use, particularly in wealthy Gulf states. The combination of wealth, a young population, and proximity to transit routes has made countries like the United Arab Emirates attractive markets for cocaine traffickers. Africa, beyond the West African transit states, has emerging cocaine markets in South Africa, Kenya, and other relatively wealthy African nations. The drug is expensive and primarily used by elite classes, but use is increasing. This global spread of cocaine means that what was once primarily an American problem has become a worldwide issue. International cooperation is essential to address it, but cooperation is complicated by different national interests, legal systems, and priorities. The United Nations has tried to coordinate international drug policy through treaties like the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, but these treaties are increasingly seen as outdated and ineffective. They mandate prohibition, making it difficult for countries to experiment with alternative approaches like decriminalization or legalization. Some countries, like Portugal and the Netherlands, have pushed the boundaries of the international treaties by implementing progressive drug policies while technically remaining in compliance. Others, particularly in Latin America, have called for rethinking the entire international drug control regime, arguing that the current approach has failed and caused more harm than good. The Global Commission on Drug Policy, which includes former presidents, prime ministers, and UN officials, has called for a shift from prohibition to regulation, arguing that the war on drugs has been a failure. Their reports have garnered significant attention, but have not yet led to major policy changes at the international level. One challenge with international drug policy is that different countries have very different interests. The United States, as the largest consumer market, has focused on reducing supply and interdicting drugs. Latin American countries, which bear the brunt of the violence, have pushed for addressing demand and considering alternatives to prohibition. European countries have experimented with harm reduction. Asian countries generally maintain strict prohibition. Finding common ground among these divergent perspectives is difficult, especially when drug policy is often driven more by politics and ideology than by evidence. Climate change adds another dimension to the global cocaine situation. Changing weather patterns could affect where coca can be grown. Some areas may become less suitable, others more suitable. This could shift production patterns, create new trafficking routes, and destabilize different regions. Globalization has made cocaine trafficking easier in some ways. International trade has exploded, making it easier to hide cocaine in the millions of shipping containers that move around the world every day. International travel has increased, providing more opportunities for drug mules. Financial globalization and the rise of cryptocurrencies have made money laundering easier. But globalization has also increased awareness and facilitated international cooperation. Information sharing between law enforcement agencies has improved. Technology allows for better tracking and intelligence gathering. International organizations and NGOs can coordinate efforts to address the root causes of drug trafficking. The future of cocaine will be shaped by these global dynamics. No single country can solve the problem alone. The United States can't eliminate cocaine by focusing only on its own borders. Colombia can't stop production without addressing the poverty that drives farmers to grow coca. European countries can't reduce use without addressing the demand factors that drive consumption. A truly effective approach would require unprecedented global cooperation, addressing supply and demand simultaneously, providing alternatives to prohibition where appropriate, investing in development and treatment, and fundamentally rethinking how we approach drugs and drug policy. Whether such cooperation is politically feasible remains an open question, but the global nature of the cocaine trade makes it clear that isolated, national approaches are insufficient. This is a global problem that requires global solutions. As we near the end of this journey through cocaine's history, I want to step back and think about what lessons we can draw from this story. What does the history of cocaine teach us about human nature, about society, about policy, about ourselves? First, it teaches us about the law of unintended consequences. At almost every stage of cocaine's history, policies intended to solve problems ended up creating new, often worse problems. Prohibition was meant to protect public health, but created a violent black market. Mandatory minimum sentences were meant to deter drug dealing, but led to mass incarceration without reducing drug availability. Crop eradication was meant to reduce supply, but displaced production and impoverished farmers. This doesn't mean we shouldn't try to address problems. It means we need to think carefully about the full range of consequences our policies might have, including consequences we don't intend or anticipate. We need humility about our ability to engineer social outcomes, and we need to be willing to change course when policies aren't working. Second, the cocaine story teaches us about the power of economic incentives. As long as there's significant demand for cocaine and prohibition keeps prices artificially high, someone will supply it. You can arrest every dealer in a city, and new dealers will emerge. You can kill or imprison every cartel leader, and new organizations will form. The underlying economics of supply and demand are incredibly powerful, and policy needs to account for that reality rather than pretending it doesn't exist. This suggests that effective drug policy needs to address both supply and demand, and needs to consider whether prohibition is the most effective framework or whether alternative approaches might work better. Third, the cocaine story teaches us about inequality and injustice. The burden of the cocaine trade has not been borne equally. Poor communities in Latin America have suffered violence and instability. Poor communities in the United States have been devastated by crack and mass incarceration. Meanwhile, wealthy users have largely avoided serious consequences, getting treatment instead of prison, using powder cocaine in upscale settings, while poor users of crack went to prison for decades. This disparity isn't accidental. It reflects deeper inequalities in society, the way race and class shape people's experiences with the criminal justice system, the way policy responds differently to problems depending on who is affected. Addressing the cocaine problem effectively would require addressing these underlying inequalities. As long as some communities are systematically disadvantaged, they'll be disproportionately affected by both drug use and drug enforcement. Fourth, the cocaine story teaches us about the importance of evidence-based policy. Too often, drug policy has been driven by moral panic, political opportunism, and ideology rather than by careful analysis of what actually works. The result has been policies that sound tough but don't actually solve problems, that make people feel like something is being done without actually improving outcomes. We have decades of data now about what works and what doesn't. We know that treatment is more effective than incarceration for reducing drug use. We know that harm reduction strategies save lives. We know that the war on drugs has not achieved its stated goals. Yet we continue implementing the same failed policies because changing course requires political courage and a willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. Fifth, the cocaine story teaches us about addiction and human vulnerability. Addiction is not a moral failing. It's a medical condition, a brain disorder that can affect anyone regardless of their character or willpower. Understanding addiction as a disease rather than a choice should fundamentally change how we respond to it, prioritizing treatment and support over punishment. But addiction doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's often rooted in trauma, mental illness, poverty, lack of opportunity, or social isolation. Addressing addiction effectively means addressing these root causes, providing people with alternatives to drug use, giving them reasons to stay sober and tools to cope with life's challenges. Sixth, the cocaine story teaches us about the importance of context and culture. The same substance, the coca leaf, has been used safely and beneficially for thousands of years in traditional contexts, but becomes devastating when isolated, concentrated, and used in different cultural settings. The way a drug is used, the social and cultural norms around it, the reasons people use it, all of these factors shape whether use is harmful or relatively benign. This suggests that one-size-fits-all policies don't work. Different communities need different approaches based on their specific circumstances, challenges, and needs. Seventh, the cocaine story teaches us about the media's power to shape perception. The way cocaine has been portrayed in news media, movies, music, and TV has profoundly influenced how people think about it. Glamorization in entertainment has made cocaine seem appealing. Sensationalistic news coverage has driven moral panic and punitive policies. Accurate, balanced information has often been lost in the noise. We need better public education about drugs, education that's honest about both risks and realities, that doesn't rely on scare tactics or exaggeration, that treats people's intelligence with respect. And we need media that portrays drug use and the drug trade with more nuance and less sensationalism. Eighth, the cocaine story teaches us about hope and resilience. Despite everything, despite the violence and addiction and incarceration, people survive. Communities rebuild. Addicts get clean. Policies change slowly, but they change. Progress is possible, even when it seems impossible. Maria left Peru and built a new life. Michael walked away from drug dealing and now helps others. Jennifer got treatment and recovered. Carlos keeps fighting for justice despite overwhelming odds. David keeps saving lives. These individual acts of courage and resilience matter, even when the big picture seems bleak. Finally, the cocaine story teaches us about our interconnectedness. The choices made by consumers in wealthy countries have direct consequences for people in poor countries. The policies enacted in one country affect people in other countries. We're all part of a global system, and we all bear some responsibility for the outcomes of that system. This interconnectedness means that we can't solve the cocaine problem through nationalism or isolationism. We need cooperation, empathy, and a willingness to think beyond our own immediate interests. We need to consider how our actions affect others, even others we'll never meet, and to make choices that reduce harm rather than simply shifting it elsewhere. As you lie there processing all of this, thinking about this long, complicated, often dark history, I want you to sit with the complexity. Resist the temptation to reduce it to simple stories of good and evil. The world is complicated, people are complicated, problems are complicated, and solutions, when they exist, are complicated too. But complexity doesn't mean hopelessness. It means we need to think carefully, act wisely, and never stop trying to make things better, even when progress is slow and setbacks are frequent. If this story has meant something to you, if it's changed how you think about drugs or policy or history, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Share your thoughts, your questions, your reflections. And if you found value in this deep dive into history, subscribe to Dreamless Timelines. We create content for people who want to think, who want to understand, who want to learn while they rest. Your support makes all of this possible. One of the most difficult questions the cocaine story raises is about personal responsibility versus social factors. To what extent are people responsible for their choices around drugs, and to what extent are they products of circumstances beyond their control? It's easy to say that anyone who uses cocaine is making a bad choice and should bear the consequences. It's also easy to say that people caught in addiction or the drug trade are victims of poverty, trauma, or a failed system and shouldn't be blamed. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in between. People do make choices, and those choices matter. Someone who decides to try cocaine for the first time is making a choice, even if they don't fully understand the risks. Someone who decides to deal drugs is making a choice, even if their options are limited. But choices are always made in context. A wealthy college student who tries cocaine at a party because they're curious is making a very different choice than a teenager in a poor neighborhood who deals crack because they need money to help their family survive. Both are making choices, but the context shapes those choices in profound ways. Responsibility is important. People need to be accountable for their actions, especially actions that harm others. But responsibility needs to be balanced with understanding and compassion. Punishment without addressing root causes doesn't solve problems. It just makes people suffer without making society safer or better. This applies at every level of the cocaine trade. The farmer growing coca is making a choice, but it's a choice shaped by poverty and lack of alternatives. The street dealer is making a choice, but it's shaped by limited opportunities and economic desperation. The cartel leader is making a choice to engage in violence and corruption, and those choices absolutely deserve consequences, but they're also shaped by a system where violence and corruption are rewarded. Even users bear some responsibility for their consumption, but addiction limits choice in ways that non-addicts often don't understand. Someone deep in addiction isn't freely choosing to use drugs in the same way someone without addiction chooses what to have for breakfast. Their brain has been changed by the drug in ways that make not using incredibly difficult. So what does this mean for policy? It means we need approaches that hold people accountable while also providing support, alternatives, and treatment. It means we need to address both individual choices and social structures. It means we can't rely solely on punishment, but we also can't ignore harmful behavior. For users, this might mean diversion programs that offer treatment as an alternative to incarceration. It might mean harm reduction services that help people use more safely while working toward recovery. It might mean removing barriers to treatment so people can get help when they're ready. For low-level dealers, it might mean focusing on providing legitimate economic opportunities rather than just arresting and imprisoning. It might mean addressing the poverty and lack of opportunity that make drug dealing attractive. For higher-level traffickers who engage in violence and corruption, it means vigorous prosecution and imprisonment, but also addressing the demand and the economic incentives that make trafficking profitable in the first place. This kind of nuanced, multifaceted approach is harder than simple tough on crime or let's legalize everything positions. It requires thinking carefully about each situation, each person, each community. It requires resources and sustained commitment, but it's more likely to actually work than the extreme positions that dominate political discourse. Individual actions matter too, not just policy. If you're someone who uses cocaine recreationally, you bear some responsibility for the violence and suffering the cocaine trade causes. That doesn't mean you're a bad person, but it does mean your choices have consequences beyond yourself. You might consider whether your recreational use is worth those consequences, and if you do choose to use, whether there are ways to reduce the harm. If you're someone struggling with addiction, seeking help isn't a sign of weakness. It's an act of courage. Treatment works, recovery is possible, and you deserve support and compassion, not judgment. If you're someone working in law enforcement or policy, consider whether the approaches you're using are actually effective or whether you're just doing what's always been done. Be willing to question assumptions, to look at evidence, to try new approaches when old ones aren't working. If you're someone who's never been directly affected by the drug trade, educate yourself. Be aware of how drug policy affects different communities differently. Support reforms that are evidence-based and humane, and don't judge people in situations you've never experienced. Social change happens through the accumulation of individual actions and choices, but it also requires systemic reforms. We need both. We need individuals to make better choices. And we need systems that make better choices possible and easier. The cocaine story shows us what happens when we focus on punishment without addressing root causes, when we ignore evidence in favor of ideology, when we allow inequality and injustice to persist. It shows us the consequences of failed policies, but it also shows us that change is possible, that people can overcome addiction, that communities can heal, that better policies can be implemented. The future isn't predetermined. We can choose differently. We can do better. It starts with understanding, with empathy, with a willingness to face uncomfortable truths and make difficult changes. As we approach the end of this marathon journey through cocaine's history, I want you to think about the weight of all this. Think about the millions of lives affected, the thousands of years of history, the countless decisions made by individuals and governments that led us to where we are today. History isn't just a collection of facts and dates. It's a living thing, a continuous story that we're all part of. The cocaine story isn't over. It's still being written right now by farmers in the Andes, by users in Manhattan, by police in Mexico, by policymakers in Washington and Brussels, by doctors in emergency rooms, by people in prison, by addicts struggling to get clean, by all of us through our choices and our actions or inactions. Every history is also a story about power. Who has it, who doesn't, how it's used and abused. The cocaine story is a story about economic power, about how the massive profits from drug trafficking corrupt governments and empower criminals. It's about political power, about how policy decisions made in wealthy countries have life and death consequences in poor countries. It's about social power, about how race and class determine who goes to treatment and who goes to prison. Understanding this power dynamic is crucial to understanding the cocaine story and to imagining better futures. The current situation didn't happen by accident. It's the result of specific decisions made by specific people in specific historical contexts. And that means different decisions could lead to different outcomes. The weight of history can feel overwhelming. When you look at the scale of the cocaine trade, the violence, the addiction, the incarceration, the corruption, it's easy to feel hopeless, to think that the problem is too big, too entrenched, too complex to solve. But history also shows us that change is possible. Slavery was once considered natural and inevitable, and it ended. Women were once denied basic rights, and that changed. Apartheid seemed permanent, and it collapsed. Every major social change seemed impossible until it happened. The cocaine situation can change too. It will require sustained effort, political courage, willingness to challenge powerful interests, and a fundamental rethinking of how we approach drugs and drug policy. But it's possible. What would a better future look like? It would look different to different people depending on their values and priorities, but maybe we can sketch some common elements. It would be a future where fewer people struggle with addiction, because we've addressed the root causes that drive problematic drug use: trauma, mental illness, poverty, lack of opportunity, social isolation. People would have support systems, mental health care, meaningful work, and connections that give them reasons to stay sober and tools to cope with life's challenges. It would be a future where people who do struggle with addiction can get treatment easily, without stigma, without fear of prosecution, with support from their communities rather than judgment. It would be a future where the violence associated with the drug trade has dramatically decreased, because we've removed the enormous black market profits that fuel it, whether through legalization, decriminalization, or other policy reforms that undercut the economic power of criminal organizations. It would be a future where farmers in coca-growing regions have genuine economic alternatives, where they can make a decent living growing legal crops, where they're not forced to choose between poverty and illegality. It would be a future where our prisons aren't filled with people whose only crime was possessing or selling drugs, where we've recognized that incarceration doesn't solve addiction and often makes it worse, where we've invested in treatment and support instead of cages. It would be a future where policy is based on evidence rather than ideology, where we honestly assess what works and what doesn't, where we're willing to try new approaches when old ones fail, where we prioritize reducing harm over appearing tough. It would be a future where the burdens of drug policy are shared more equitably, where wealthy white users don't get a pass while poor black users go to prison, where we apply our principles consistently regardless of race or class. It would be a future where we understand our global interconnectedness, where wealthy consumer countries take responsibility for the consequences their demand creates in poorer producer countries, where we work cooperatively rather than imposing solutions from afar. Is this realistic? Can we actually get there from here? Honestly, I don't know. The obstacles are immense. Changing drug policy requires overcoming powerful political opposition, entrenched bureaucracies, international treaties, public misconceptions, and the enormous economic interests of both criminal organizations and the prison industrial complex. But I do know that we'll never get to a better future if we don't even try, if we accept the status quo as inevitable, if we let cynicism and hopelessness prevent us from working toward change. And I know that individual actions matter, even when the problem seems overwhelming. Every person who chooses not to use cocaine is reducing demand. Every person who seeks treatment is breaking the cycle of addiction. Every person who supports evidence-based policy reforms is helping shift the political landscape. Every person who treats drug users and people involved in the trade with compassion rather than judgment is helping to reduce stigma and create space for healing. Large-scale change happens through the accumulation of countless small changes. Social movements, policy reforms, cultural shifts, they all begin with individuals deciding that the current situation is unacceptable and that they're going to do something about it, even if it's small. So here's what I want to leave you with as you drift towards sleep. The cocaine story is a human story, a story about us, about the choices we make individually and collectively, about the societies we build, about the priorities we hold, about the values we live by. It's a story that reveals both the worst and the best of humanity. The worst, greed, violence, corruption, indifference to suffering. The best, courage, resilience, compassion, the determination to keep fighting for justice even when the odds seem impossible. You are part of this story, whether you realize it or not. The choices you make, the values you hold, the policies you support, the way you treat people who are struggling, it all matters. You have agency, you have power, maybe not as much as you'd like, but more than you think. Use it, think critically, question assumptions, demand evidence, support policies that reduce harm rather than simply punishing people. Treat everyone, including people caught up in addiction or the drug trade, with the compassion and dignity they deserve as human beings. Work toward a future that's better than the past, even when change seems slow or impossible. And remember that understanding is the first step toward change. By listening to this entire history, by engaging with the complexity rather than accepting simple narratives, you've already taken that first step. You understand more about cocaine, about drug policy, about the interconnections between individual choices and global systems than most people ever will. What you do with that understanding is up to you. As we come to the end of this journey through the complete history of cocaine, I want to thank you for staying with me through this long, complex, often difficult story. We've traveled from the ancient Andes to modern cities, from coca leaves to white powder, from indigenous medicine to global crisis. We've seen empires rise and fall, policies succeed and fail, lives destroyed and rebuilt. The story of cocaine is not just history. It's happening right now, continuing to unfold in real time. Farmers are growing coca, traffickers are smuggling, users are consuming, police are arresting, people are dying, people are recovering, policymakers are debating, and all of us are affected in ways large and small. If you've made it this far, if you've listened to this entire chronicle while drifting in and out of sleep, you now know more about cocaine than 99% of people. You understand the history, the economics, the science, the policy debates, the human cost. You understand the complexity, the nuance, the way simple solutions don't work for complicated problems. Take that knowledge with you. Let it inform how you think about drugs, about policy, about justice, about the world. Let it make you more compassionate toward people struggling with addiction. Let it make you more skeptical of simplistic political slogans. Let it make you more aware of your own place in global systems of supply and demand, cause and effect. And if you found value in this deep exploration of history, if you appreciated the thoroughness, the honesty, the refusal to accept easy answers, then please subscribe to Dreamless Timelines. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, because we're creating more content like this, more deep dives into fascinating, important, complex topics that deserve more than surface-level treatment. Leave a comment telling me what you thought. Tell me what surprised you, what challenged your assumptions, what you want to learn about next. Your engagement helps us grow and create better content. And share this with people who might find it valuable. Share it with people who care about history, about policy, about understanding the world in all its complexity. Share it with people who are struggling, who need to know they're not alone, who need hope that change is possible. The night is deep now, your body is relaxed, your mind has absorbed an incredible amount of information, 5,000 years of history compressed into a few hours. Let it settle in your consciousness like sediment drifting to the bottom of a lake. Let it become part of how you understand the world. Sleep well, dream deep. And when you wake, you'll wake with knowledge, with understanding, with a more complete picture of one of the most consequential substances in human history. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Thank you for your time, your attention, your willingness to engage with difficult topics. Thank you for being part of the Dreamless Timelines community. Until next time, rest easy, sleep deeply, and never stop learning. This is Dreamless Timelines, bringing you history for sleep, knowledge for the curious, and stories that matter. Good night.